Since its release, I have uncovered hidden meanings and symbolisms within Metaphor ReFantazio's characters. With many of these discoveries, I can confidently say I'm the only person to have realized them, so I'm thrilled to be able to share them with you all. Sit back, relax, and enjoy this comprehensive video that explains every single major character within this game's narrative. I promise you, you will have way more appreciation for this game's story and characters once you finish watching this. Metaphor ReFantazio is jam-packed with many different themes and characters with the wonderful backdrop of a creatively conceptualized world that truly captures fantasy. With that said, there is one sole character who represents the core themes and ideas of this game more than anybody else, and surprisingly, it's not the main character. The character who represents the core vision of Metaphor ReFantazio the most is Euphausia Etoreika, otherwise known as Eupha. In this video, I'll be explaining why this is true, and I'll additionally be exploring the deeper underlying meanings that can be found within her character. Let's head back to Uchronia and discuss. In an interview with Famitsu prior to Metaphor's release, its director Katsura Hashino said that the core theme in the story of Metaphor ReFantazio is ideals versus reality. Nobody embodies the struggle between these two concepts more than Eupha. You see, while the first word that comes to mind when I think of Eupha is wifey, the second and perhaps more objective word would be idealist. An idealist is defined as a person who is guided more by ideals than by practical considerations. Eupha's idealist nature permeates throughout her character and is perhaps the most omnipresent trait we see in almost everything she says. From her innocent putdown of Milo, where she's genuinely trying to understand what he's about in spite of his conniving scumbag nature having already been laid bare, to her grand commitment to sacrificing herself for her people without a second thought, Eupha's ideals largely come before practical considerations when she approaches situations. Allow me to clearly ascertain what exactly Eupha's ideals are before we continue. In my estimation, there are two words that form basically the entirety of Eupha's ideals, and they are empathy and grace. Empathy is described as the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. In other words, it's the capacity to willfully put yourself in somebody else's shoes before you cast judgments. It's the desire to seek out and then keep front of mind how somebody else's experiences can dictate their behaviors. Obviously, the greatest example of Eupha exhibiting this trait is how she accepted her role as Etria's sacrifice to the dragon god. In spite of the fact that from birth she was a living sacrifice with no choice or agency other than to die, she not only accepted it, but she held no reservations. Her empathy led her to place herself in the villagers' shoes and understand that they're just people who wanted to live and who believed that she was the only thing that could provide that to them through her sacrifice. There wasn't malice behind their wishes for her eventual death, but instead hopeful optimism. Now, she could have the empathy to commit herself to laying down her life for her village and then rightfully harbor hatred to the same village due to the unfair circumstances, but she doesn't, due to the other word that forms Eupha's ideals, that word being grace. Grace is defined as courteous goodwill. Now, bear with me here. Courteous equates to considerate, and to be considerate is to be careful not to hurt others. To have goodwill is to be friendly, helpful, and cooperative. So, Eupha's endless capacity for grace, or courteous goodwill, allows her to love her people in spite of the circumstances and to consider said circumstances a blessing because it's the power to save others. So, Eupha is the personification of empathy and grace. These are the ideals that guide Metaphor ReFantazio's biggest idealist. Now, at this juncture, it may seem like Eupha is cookie-cutter basic good girl. But remember, Metaphor ReFantazio's director Katsura Hashino said that the core theme surrounding this game's vision and narrative is ideals versus reality, and I'm claiming that Eupha embodies this concept. Now that we've established her idealist nature, let's get into how that clashes with reality. So one of the things about Eupha that I think makes her such a compelling character is that in spite of the fact that she's lived her entire life under the established dogma of Etria, she has the bravery of heart to choose instead to grow rather than remain stagnant in her beliefs. Like, honestly, most people do throughout their lives. You have to consider, Eupha has been indoctrinated her whole life. Not only that, but her ideals uphold the indoctrination. The indoctrination Eupha faces is that the priestess of Etria sacrifices themselves to the dragon god Et upon the slightest inconvenience to the village. Hurricane hits the island, sacrifice the priestess. Crops underperform, sacrifice the priestess. Fortin sends a bunch of people to loot your land, sacrifice the priestess. We are talking about hundreds of years of Etrian priestesses laying down their lives for the village. Not only that, but Eupha's parents died in a voyage to the temple of the dragon god, and the villagers largely claim that the reason the sea took them was because they didn't uphold the traditions of the village. So Eupha's indoctrination is two-pronged in that Hundreds of years of Etrian history seemingly support the indoctrination as truth, and also the tragic personal loss of her parents is considered by the islanders to also support the indoctrination as truth. In spite of all this, Eupha finds the strength to break free of the mental shackles that have constrained her people's worldview for centuries. Now, remember, an idealist is defined as a person who is guided more by ideals than by practical considerations. In the critical moment, Eupha displays tremendous growth in that she chooses to accept the evidence in front of her eyes rather than blindly stick to the self-sacrifice route. In other words, her archetype awakening is the first moment that she follows practical considerations primarily and her ideals secondarily. Now, if you've watched any of my videos on this game before, then you know what we do here is we peel back the layers of symbolism that the writers of Metaphor intended when they sat down and created this wonderful world and story. I think this is a good moment to stop and explore under the surface. Let me explain to you the deepest underlying layers of symbolism when it comes to Eupha's character. Obviously, when it comes to the Mustari at large, maybe the first thing that comes to mind is their mask. Most all Mustari wear masks when they are out and about in the world. The mask of the Mustari is a metaphor that represents how they as a people have willfully blinded themselves and chosen to follow a dogma that sacrifices the lives of innocent girls with great potential out of a warped sense of self-preservation for the many. The mask represents their willful choice to mask themselves from the rational consideration that the priestess's sacrifice is wrong. But with Eupha, the mask is meant to symbolize and represent even more than that. Something that caught my eye with Eupha is the unique design of her mask and the scenes in which we see her wearing the mask. Allow me to elucidate. Eupha's mask bears a striking resemblance to the chess piece, the pawn. Everything fell into place once I tracked this. You see, for those of you unfamiliar with chess, pawns have less movements available to them than any other chess piece on the board, and for the most part they can only move forward one square at a time. This parallels Eupha's role as priestess in how she has no agency in her life. She has less freedom than other people and she can only move forwards. With consideration to this, it would be fair to say that the pawn represents resilience. Pawns have the least agency and freedom, and yet they form the front line to protect others and march forwards to their death irrepressibly, which is the exact same as how Eupha marches towards her death for others. But here's the thing, pawns also represent progress and possess an unrivaled latent potential. You see, pawns are the only piece in chess that have the potential for promotion. When a pawn reaches the other side of the chessboard, it then has the power to transform into the strongest piece on the board, the queen. A queen is the only piece in chess that has the power to mostly make any movement on the board. In other words, they possess unrivaled freedom and agency. Are you following my meaning? Let me lay it all out for you. In Eupha's archetype awakening scene, her mask literally explodes, and it isn't just for the aesthetics. This is a deliberate representation and symbolization of her metaphorically reaching the other side of the chessboard and promoting from a pawn to a queen. In this moment, she has finally secured her first great triumph in her struggle with the core theme of this game, ideals versus reality. Eupha, the ardent idealist, has finally broken her indoctrination and made practical considerations without compromising her ideals. Her perseverance to continually march forward one square at a time has paid off, and she's no longer a pawn, but a queen. Don't believe me? As we know, royal archetypes are meant to be the truest reflection of the party's soul and ideals. The protagonist unlocks Prince once he realizes his true self, Hulkenberg unlocks Royal Knight, so on and so forth. Have a look at Eupha's royal archetype. You may have guessed by now, but it looks exactly like the chess piece of the queen. To finalize this line of thought, let me reiterate that Eupha's journey mirrors that of the pawn in chess perfectly. Not just hers, but all Etrian priestesses. Just like pawns on a chessboard, they move forwards and inevitably perish, always the first to be sacrificed for the sake of the rest of the board or their people. But Eupha was the pawn who managed to reach the other side. She persevered through hell and reached an enlightenment that allowed her to claim her birthright and become the most powerful Mustari who protects their people. She became the personification of the chess piece, the queen. If this isn't enough evidence for you, then I believe it would be appropriate to consider a Denny. After all, he is basically Eupha's older brother and parents roll into one with consideration to their parents' death. He's a core part of Eupha's character. Look at his mask. It quite clearly symbolizes and represents the castle piece from chess. This was a deliberate design choice because while castles can move many squares at a time, they are confined to only moving in straight lines. In other words, in spite of the fact that Denny is the leader of the village, he's confined by the villagers' beliefs and his own indoctrination and can only do so much in his efforts to protect his sister from her demise. He attempts a lot to protect her from her fate, but is only able to do so much. Additionally, if you don't know, Castles were not just where royals resided, but a place in which people could retreat into to remain safe from war or attacking countries. Edeni, as the leader of the Mustari, is whom the people flock to and hide behind and beg to uphold their tradition. He is the safe space for the Mustari people, the one expected to assuage all worries and protect them. I want to address and clarify one more thing, and that is the fact that Euphausia is Metaphor ReFantazio's real protagonist. Now, remember, Metaphor's director Kashino Hatsura stated that the core theme surrounding Metaphor ReFantazio is ideals versus reality. While you may now agree with me at this point that Euphausia represents that struggle more than anyone, you might still hold reservations about me saying that Euphausia is the game's real protagonist. Let me expound upon this notion. So, a lot of people hear the word protagonist and simply think it equates to main character or good guy in the story, but one of the definitions of protagonist is an advocate or champion of a particular cause or idea. When you take everything we've discussed into consideration, then it is clear that Euphausia is the primary advocate or champion for the core vision and main themes of Metaphor ReFantazio, and thus it would be fair to say that she is the real protagonist of this game. Within the narrative itself, Euphausia's own experiences most closely reflect the core theme of the game. There are many examples of this, but a great example that comes to mind is when Euphausia meets Ovi's sick mother. She's quick to point out that she doesn't believe prayer alone can help those people. In other words, instead of clinging blindly to Sanctus ideals, they need to make practical considerations in order to actually heal the sick people. I want to end this character analysis with a quote, because I believe it deliberately states outright a lot of what we've been talking about. What's fascinating is that it isn't a big speech or monologue, but instead it's a seemingly throwaway comment. This quote reflects Euphausia's growth and enlightenment, and for me it serves as such a perfect way to highlight that she is a queen and no longer a pawn. After you face down the elegy of the soul, Euphausia says, "The true enemy is the mind that refuses to see the abstract complexities of the world around them." How perfect is that? Remember, an idealist is defined as a person who is guided more by ideals than by practical considerations. Euphausia is essentially saying here that ideals are well and good, but if you don't have the capacity to perceive the abstract complexities, then you won't be able to properly achieve what you need to do. In other words, you need to let your ideals inform how you make practical considerations, not let them dominate to the point that you don't consider what is practical. When it comes to the core theme of Metaphor ReFantazio, the struggle of ideals versus reality, Euphausia's ascendant journey of self-discovery beautifully encapsulated the theme. She's a wonderful character, and I really wanted to make this video to showcase that. I know the most alluring part of her character for probably over 90% of players is her cute, open, and honest affection for yourself as the main character, but there is way more depth to Euphausia than how she pines for the player character. She's a whole entire complex character independent of that, and that is part of what makes Wifey so special.
I felt it to be a sort of miracle. I never thought I'd be involved in any way with followers of Sanctism. That's why I was so hesitant at first. When I found myself clashing with them, I became even more unsure of what was right. But then, that very unsurety is what turned out to be the most important feeling, did it not? Once I learned what frustrated me, what I refused to compromise on, I knew then who I really am at my core. It led me to a realization. I only want to live in a world where you exist.
I feel the same way as you, Euphausia.
I can see what they're doing, what he's doing. I can see it, I feel it. He's cooking.
Do you mean I can stay by your side? Truly, you'll grant me something so special. It's all I could ask for. Just know that for me, no one could possibly replace you.
Uchronia's preeminent songstress Juani Cygnus, otherwise known as Juna, is probably the definition of the word iconic. One only needs to hear a few of her voice lines to agree with this statement.
Tremble before me! I've got just the dance for you. You might say it's to die for. Power can be so intoxicating. I'll give you the performance of a lifetime. Not bad, eh? I feel a song coming on. Applause, please.
but I worry that her iconic nature has led to her being misunderstood and quite frankly underrated by most people who play this game. The irony of this, of course, is that this is pretty meta if you consider that a core part of Juna's character is her efforts to make people misunderstand her. This might not make sense now, but let's head back to Uchronia and discuss. I think when it comes to Juna's story within this game, one of the best decisions they made was to only reveal to you her past pretty far down the line in her social link. This means that you spend the majority of your time with her basically assuming that she is a certain way. And what way is that? Juna comes across for the entire game as a debonair, uber-confident person who fears nothing and nobody. She's somebody who has the power to sway anybody's heart that she encounters and overcome any trial that she faces. This is most reflected in the fact that Mirtis, who literally hates Juna, likes her and respects her by the end of her social link, and also how Juna is able to root herself in Luis's inner circle. Yeah, Luis, the guy who deliberately forms bonds with nobody and is single-minded on his mission and path to end the world. The last and probably most obvious evidence that Juna is a debonair icon is the fact that she's one of the most famous people on the continent due to her beauty and singing talent. But here's the thing. When you apply the context of Juna's past and read between the lines on a few of the things that she says, you will find that at her core she is potentially the most human character in the game, not an unrelatable demigoddess who's never known adversity. Let's start with her past. As a child, Juna was a slave. This culminated in Juna being tied up to a tree as some twisted form of punishment for days on end. Eventually, she was found and adopted into House Cygnus, a powerful Sanctus Ishkia house. I want to pause here because I think this is a very important intersection in Juna's life. You see, Juna is very pure in that at her core she just wants to make the world a better place. And this desire to help others, to give hope to others, is rooted in both her time as a slave and from her relationship with Rella. To elucidate, when Juna was tied up to the tree, the only thing that kept her going was singing. And so through her song, she wants to give hope to others. That's the main reason that she sings. She feels that music literally saved her life as it gave her the will to live when she was at her lowest point. Now, in terms of getting adopted into House Cygnus, of course this is how she became Rella's adopted little sister. As we know, Rella is known as Saint Rella. She's beloved by the kingdom because she spent many years healing people in need with no conditional expectations of payment or anything in return. So I wanted to stop at this intersection because you can clearly see from here how the core of Juna's ideals was formed. She sings to inspire hope in others because of how singing got her through horrible experiences as a child, and she's extremely passionate about making the world a better place, in part due to her proximity to her sister Rella over the years and seeing the way that she worked tirelessly to help people in need. You could understand that when a person like Rella tells Juna to sing so that her voice may reach the most people possible, that could really light a fire in you. An example of these ideals being displayed in Confluence is when she sings for a child when she doesn't need to, and she says yes to perform for the merchant's laborers in an irrelevant event when she doesn't need to. And on top of that, she wants her pay to go to the audience. So we've defined Juna's motivations and how they formed, but there's another component to Juna that we must discuss, and that is that she is Nydia. Of course, the clan secret of the Nydia people is that they are essentially shapeshifters. Their true form is physically that of a small child, and nobody sees this form except for their birth parents. As soon as they're old enough, they begin to transform. So, Nydia people hide their true selves for their entire lives. Let's unpack this. How would you feel if the entire world told you that your true authentic self was an embarrassment and that they didn't want you to show it at all in public? If the world basically said, don't come outside unless you're wearing a mask? How would you feel if then, after that, the world fell in love with you with your mask on, but you're hyper aware of the fact that you're wearing a mask and what they love isn't you in your natural state? Well, while a variety of mental health issues could stem from said circumstances, you'd be likely to develop some form of imposter syndrome. If you don't know, imposter syndrome is when you doubt your own skills and successes. You feel you're not as talented or worthy as others believe, and you're scared that one day people will realize that. This is something that affects a lot of people in real life, and due to her circumstances, we can see this at play within Juna. Her early formative years as a slave were spent being told by the world that she was less than nothing and not good enough. Working in conjunction with that is her status as a Nydia, where the implication of their transformation is that the world doesn't approve of what they truly are. I want to pause here and briefly talk about where I'm certain some of the inspiration for Juna's character came from. I don't know if you've heard of this story, but it's a pretty famous Danish fairy tale from 1843 called The Ugly Duckling. To oversimplify it, Basically, there's a duckling that hatches out of its egg and faces adversity everywhere it goes. It suffers abuses from the other animals until it encounters a flock of migrating swans. It tries to join them and is shocked when the swans welcome and accept it. It sees its reflection in the water and realizes that it wasn't an ugly duckling, but a beautiful swan the entire time. It then takes flight with its new swan family. So, obviously this journey mirrors Juna's extremely closely. She was an unwanted child who suffered the abuse of slavery until eventually she was found and adopted into House Cygnus. By the time we meet Juna, she's the most famous songstress in the world, heralded for her beauty. The theme of the ugly duckling lines up and resonates with Juna's struggles as well, because a major theme of the ugly duckling story is to accept people for their qualities and values, not for their appearance. The story's message is that appearances are misleading and that it's better to accept someone for their good qualities than their physical looks. This obviously lines up seamlessly with the dilemma of the Nydia people, that they feel that they must transform so that the world pays attention to their qualities and not their physical looks. This is where there's a slight difference in the parallel between Juna and the ugly duckling though, because in the story, the ugly duckling was actually a swan the entire time. In Juna's case, her appearance the world fell in love with is actually a mask metaphorically speaking, and in the same way she's an adopted Cygnus, she's not actually a swan herself. Even though her mask is authentically her, it is still a standard Nydia guise. If you're sitting there feeling like I'm reaching bringing this story up, then I want to share one last thing. Juna's name, of course, is Juani Cygnus, as she was adopted into House Cygnus. Well, guess what? The name Cygnus literally means swan. So, just like the ugly duckling, Juna was accepted into a family of swans and took on their identity. For my 2 cents, this is really cool symbolism, and it's clear that the ugly duckling parable partly inspired Juna as a character. Now, to continue. There are comments that Juna makes here and there throughout the game that if you read between the lines, you can perceive a little bit of imposter syndrome at work. After she reveals to you her true form, she says, "It's never felt right to me disguising ourselves. Is being myself really so horrible? Is it so wrong?" Juna has an internal sweeping generalization that being herself is wrong, when in actuality, the idea of Nydia transforming to fit in is an act that doesn't actually say anything about the individual. It's just something that is, like how we put on clothes before we leave the house so we can exist in society. Obviously these are different things, but I feel like that comparison realistically is close to the ideology behind Nydia transforming. It's not so much that the real Nydia form is bad, it's more so that they transform so people don't get blinded by what they look like and then can't respect the content of their characters. Again, as an example, if you show up to a job interview with pajamas or sweats, they likely won't be able to look past that to see your qualifications, but if you wear the appropriate clothing, then they'll be able to evaluate the content of your character. Part of me wonders if Juna had been raised by her Nydia parents in a stable household, if she would have had this mental relationship with transforming. Is this relationship with transforming a universal Nydia thing, or is it just Juna's unique background that allows her to have this perception? I'm not exactly sure of the answer, as there isn't a lot of Nydia lore in the game, or other Nydia characters that we can draw evidence from. Jin is a tool, and Alonso doesn't really talk explicitly about what his feelings are about being Nydia. Regardless, let's get back on track. Juna's case of imposter syndrome is largely reflected in her actions more than the things she says. I think this connects to one of the most misunderstood parts of Juna's character, and that is her propensity for flirting, or when she turns on her seductive songstress persona. Juna, for the most part, doesn't flirt for fun or as a simple distraction. When I really took a second to think through the scenes, I realized that Juna almost exclusively flirts when she's in fear. Think about it. She does it when she's undercover around Luis a lot, both with him and his men. She does it when you catch her in Luis's study. She does it when the Magnus brothers are very close to finding out that the two of you are lying. The seductive songstress persona is Juna's defense mechanism. Here's some more evidence to support that notion. Just from what we see in the game, it's clear that Juna has an interest in the main character. But if you've noticed, she always pursues you in a way where she walks back her statements of interest and almost kind of hides it behind the mask of, "Oh, I'm just being playful." This is because Juna has a fear of abandonment due to her early childhood, and so instead of openly and honestly conveying interest, she plays around with you for the most part instead. You can kind of see this with the fact that every time you honestly express interest in her or say something extremely nice to her, she'll usually get a little bit uncomfortable. I believe this is a mix of her having trouble accepting praise due to her imposter syndrome and a general fear of abandonment. A deep fear that she actually is an ugly duckling. This actually comes to a head in your last conversation with Juna prior to the final confrontation with Luis. You meet outside of Rella's church, and she admits that she's been thinking of the future with you, but she shares that she keeps putting off talking to you about it basically out of fear of what you may say. I'd argue that her admitting this is one of her most vulnerable moments in the game, on par with when she shows you her true self, because after so many conversations, she's able to state out loud that she's fearful of you not reciprocating interest or your story ending. If the imposter syndrome component to her character isn't quite fitting for you, I would implore you to think about it this way. Shouldn't the world's preeminent songstress be confident enough to say openly, honestly, hey, I want you, and I'm me, so you should definitely want me back? Juna would be confident enough to do that, except she doesn't actually believe and fully accept all of the things that the world thinks of her, because of her imposter syndrome. There's a bit of a cognitive disconnect for Juna due to the context of her background, where she doesn't fully embrace all that the world says she is. A quote of hers that stands out to me is when she says, "All I do is show the audience the me that I want to be." In spite of the fact that, in reality, that's who Juna really is. Instead of her perception of her true self only being her original form and the person she is away from the stage, the fact is that her true self is both that and the songstress on stage who captivated the country. It's sad because at the same time, Juna says, "Sometimes I think singing is all I amount to, it's lonely." So it's like Juna concurrently doesn't think her onstage songstress persona is her at all, and at the same time, that onstage persona is all anybody values about her as a person. While that is sad, it's honestly very beautiful that Juna is who she is in spite of these storms raging inside of her. You see, Juani Cygnus is bold as fuck. I know I keep mentioning quotes from her in this video, but this is partly because she says so many things that tell you a lot. In other words, basically none of her voice lines are empty of meanings or subtext. To continue, at one point Juna says, "The harder something gets, the more determined I am to see it done." Juna is indomitable in the pursuit of her goals, and I think this largely stems from her experience as a child. Juna survived and persevered through horrific circumstances, so I believe she's of the mindset now that she can achieve anything because she's already faced down and defeated her life's greatest trial, literally as a child. Her boldness and indomitable nature is most reflected in her archetype awakening scene. Juna's the only character in the entire game who's like, "Aight bro, you running archetypes? That shit's crazy, but bet, I could do that shit too though." Like, while she does have a background of studying magic and her sister is arguably the most knowledge mage in the kingdom, I don't think that's enough to justify this. After all, Grius had studied archetypes his whole life, but when he saw it, he didn't say right away, "I understand it now," and then transform. But Juna basically does that, and I think that's more than anything a testament to her indomitable mentality forged from the fires of a horrific childhood, and the many years afterwards spent rediscovering herself and the power she possesses to affect people's hearts next to Rella. Juna's blatant self-belief is awe-inspiring, and it's what allows her to so readily awaken. So you see, dualities and complexities exist within Juna perhaps more than any other character in the game. I've just finished saying that she has an awesome self-belief, but earlier in the video I was analyzing how imposter syndrome impacts her. So you might be confused on what my message or my final analysis is of Juna, but I already told you. She's the most human character in the game. What are we in real life if not walking contradictions and dualities? That complexity is the essence of being human. Our perceptions of others, our perceptions of ourselves, none of these are ever perfect or completely and cohesively following logic. The same is true for Juna. She has imposter syndrome and thinks the world only values her for her singing, and she doesn't take full responsibility for who she is on the stage. She's afraid of abandonment and charms her way out of precarious situations. Yet, at the same time, she has a self-belief and a capability worthy of the world's greatest songstress. In fact, I don't know if you know this, but a persona is defined as the aspect of someone's character that is presented to or perceived by others. Juna possesses many personas within her soul: the famous songstress, the seductive flirt, the hero who champions hope, the vulnerable friend who supports and looks out for yourself and the Magnus brothers. This is why one of her archetypes is called Persona Master. She's exactly that. She's the master of situationally shifting her disposition for different scenarios. In other words, when she says the line, "This will be the performance of a lifetime," I believe that this is essentially her ethos. She's constantly swapping out and wearing different masks of her persona and performing. This is also reflected in her gameplay. Her archetype is literally based around swapping out different masks for different situations. This feels like very deliberate game design, But while she believes that this means that nobody knows the real her and that the real her is only what she keeps hidden away, her vulnerable Nydia form with a history of being unwanted and a slave, this is where she's wrong. The real Juna is the entirety of all of her personas and all of her history. Her performance of a lifetime is her performing as Juna. I want to leave you with this. The pursuit of trying to match who we perceive ourselves to be and who others think we are is the defining human journey. Now, does all that we've discussed about Juna make sense? Only if you consider that she's meant to be human just like us. Juna's character beneath the surface makes sense because it doesn't make sense. Make sense?
And you personally saved me from danger back there. I'm terribly grateful to you. You're lucky, really. I'll have you know I'm rarely this candid.
Today's video is going to hit for the vast majority of you because today we are analyzing the man who is apparently the most beloved Metaphor ReFantazio character. Today we analyze Leon Strohl, the Haliaetus, the reigning king of Atlus's character poll in which fans voted for their favorite character. While I may be shocked that he finished a convincing #1, I can honestly tell you that I'm fully aware of the reasons why, and I hope they become clear by the end of this video. Strohl is a complex character who manages to be a virtuous paragon that is simultaneously very raw and relatable in terms of the way that he processes things and exists in the world. Before we continue, I hope you know that when you speak, I listen. And in our last video where we analyzed the legend that is Luis Guiabern, many of you mentioned that you enjoyed how easy the video was to follow along, which is in spite of the fact that we covered a lot of deep concepts. So let's continue with the format that we used in the last video. To do so, I've broken this analysis into 4 sections: Strohl as an individual, his role in the story, his key relationships, and his hidden symbolisms. Let's head back to Uchronia and discuss. Let's start this video where Strohl himself would probably start, were you to ask him to give an account of himself.
A noble's duty is to protect their people. I shall fight as the noble I am. Any good noble knows how to dance.
That's right. Let's start with illuminating what exactly Strohl's nobility means for his character. While it may stick out to you or you may find it annoying, it's not an oversight from the writers that Strohl is constantly mentioning his status as a noble. This in itself is a thread for us to follow, and should we pull it, we can unravel the core determinants that make Strohl the way that he is. Strohl isn't just a Clamar, which along with the Rusant are the 2 top races in the world. He also belonged to a noble family that hails from the village Halia. When Strohl was a child, his village was attacked by a human, and to his knowledge, everyone he knew, including his parents, died. Let's talk about his upbringing prior to this happening. At one point in the game, Strohl clearly defines what exactly nobility is in the world of Metaphor ReFantazio. He explains that to be lord of a prosperous house is the ambition of all nobles in the country. He defines what is, quite frankly, an archaic system, explaining how forging aristocratic alliances and currying favor from royals are typical activities for nobles, and he also explains that the typical path a noble takes in life would be marrying some wealthy lord's daughter and then dutifully planning out the siring of heirs. To get the point across, he even mentions that if he had a daughter, her hand would be promised to another family at birth. So you see, these are all quite standard contemplations for nobles. But here's the thing, Strohl's parents were very atypical. In spite of their noble status, they were magnanimous individuals who never treated others as lesser people, which is reflected in personal accounts of them that we encounter in the game, and the fact that Strohl's father constantly did charity work in the capital. So all things considered, prior to the human attack on the village, Strohl had it great and enjoyed a privileged life that very few people did. But this foundation manifests in a really interesting way after the human attack on his village. We meet Strohl 7 years after the attack had happened, and as we spend time with him, we get hints here and there into the fact that deep down, Strohl harbors the sense that he is a failure. But why is this? Every time we see Strohl do or say something, he comes across as extremely competent, inventive, clever, kind. So how could he have such a low opinion of himself hidden within? To be honest, you really have to read between the lines on this one because a lot of it isn't said explicitly, so I'll try my best to illustrate this in a way that makes sense. Strohl has a low opinion of himself because he got it in his head that he owes a debt to his parents and his people, and that he was and is a disappointment to his parents, who he has on a pedestal as just the absolute best. This sentiment is compounded by the fact that Strohl is a noble. As a noble, there is a clear expectation of being of use for your house. Perhaps even more so for Strohl being the child of righteous nobles. For example, something his parents constantly said to him was, A nobleman is the shield in his people's hands, durable enough to protect them, but light enough to carry, else what value does he have? To quickly explain, basically this quote means that Strohl's parents were telling him that it was a noble's job to protect others without infringing upon their freedoms or adding an unbearable weight to their lives. In less words, their mantra was to be selfless and to leverage their privilege on behalf of others. So you can see the magnitude of the gravity of expectation that Strohl grew up with. The unfathomable weight of responsibility wasn't just his noble status, but his parents' ideal of what a noble should be. And Strohl doesn't feel like he was of use for House Halia. After all, it was destroyed as he powerlessly watched, and prior to that he didn't do anything of significance. So you see, because Strohl's parents died when he was young, they never got to see the man that he grew into. They never got to see that they were effective parents whose love and morals serve as Strohl's compass in life. He was right at the end of his childhood when they passed, and children are often petulant and ignorant. I think he struggles with having, by all accounts, perfect parents because as he grows into a fully realized adult and understands the immensity of his parents' quality, he begins to think that they must have been disappointed in him because he wasn't even close to their ideal when they were still alive. But here's the thing, Strohl was a child. Strohl's parents didn't expect him to be perfect and righteous and obedient. They loved him and supported him unconditionally and believed that he would come good. So to bring this full circle, the reason that Strohl is a broken record when it comes to mentioning that he's a noble is because he's overcompensating. Strohl is in a perpetual state of trying to prove himself, of trying to be of value to others. He is constantly trying to live up to his parents' ideal of a noble. What's admirable about Strohl in his pursuit of the Haliaetus noble ideal is that he's largely successful in spite of his emotional turmoil within. He even confides in you at one point that in spite of his brave face that he puts on, he's actually terrified. He explicitly states that he's terrified of losing to Louise, but given the context of all that we've discussed, we can glean that Strohl's fear largely surrounds his innermost feelings of being a failure who doesn't provide value and support to others. His fear is that his efforts to do good and reverse his self-perceived debt to others in the world, as a noble of House Haliaetus, will ultimately be fruitless.
If Louise was behind it, then that's all I need to know. He's the one who'll answer for it. I have my own reason to fight now. I don't want to be an ally of convenience alone, so once more, please, let me join your cause.
What do you say, Grius?
I see keeping an eye on you was too much trouble in the first place.
So you've no objections? What say you, friend?
We're brothers in arms, my friend.
Brothers in... yes. I'll do my best to deserve that honor. Now, onward.
Strohl is your first companion, and it would be fair to say that he's your most ardent supporter. It's critical that Strohl joins you first because from the outside perspective, he adds legitimacy to your endeavors as a Clamar noble. Additionally, from an experiential point of view, his understanding of how the world works guides you constantly throughout the narrative. He's a legitimately valuable advisor, and throughout the entire narrative, his wit and creativity is a saving grace for the party at various junctures. He understands political positioning and keeps the party cognizant of how your actions will be perceived as you apply for the throne. Strohl is always quick to address the masses and spin things in your favor, such as after the first fight with Louise where you kill him. He leads the group many times in your stead, but it's never in a disrespectful way. It's always in situations where he feels his skill set is what is best suited. Strohl doesn't want power or to be the shot caller. He just wants to utilize his innate talents and advantages in the service of helping others, which of course connects back to the impact his parents had on his life. Honestly, I suspect that if we were to tally it up, Strohl probably has the most lines of dialogue in this game. So I'd imagine some people who play this game may feel like, whoa, Strohl talks and does so much, so why isn't he just the main character? Because there are a lot of moments in this game where you can feel like a passenger, and many of those are because of Strohl's presence, but I want to refute that sentiment that Strohl possesses more narrative importance than the main character, or the idea that Strohl is the real leader. To put it as simply as possible, Strohl couldn't do what you do. Through authenticity and proactive communication, both verbal and nonverbal, you as the main character are a great interpersonal connector. Your leadership and dedication to unconditional empathy creates a warmth and allure that no other character has in the narrative. You are the catalyst that draws his supporters to your cause, not Strohl. Strohl is a bit aloof because he's not over himself and the constant internal struggles that he has. His complex with living up to his parents' ideal of a noble, and his hatred towards Luis and humans for burning his home means that he's a bit difficult to connect with below the surface level. In fact, I say that it actually takes him the entire game to process through his internal feeling of being a failure and his hatred. This is especially clear in the epilogue where we see a light and grateful Strohl who seems to be so comfortable in who he is and what his goals are, and quite simply happy. But I'd say as early as the final confrontation with Luis, you can see how much Strohl has grown. You can see that the journey across Uchronia has wizened Strohl in a way where he's able to act how his parents would and put aside his personal hatred and try to employ empathy with Luis. To continue explaining why Strohl couldn't do what the player character does in this story, while he's amicable with everyone, there's no point in the story where he deeply inspires somebody else or helps another character have an emotional breakthrough. For example, like how Hulkenberg guides Yufa to her archetype awakening. So for the crowd that think that the writing is unbalanced and that Strohl could be the main character because of his large presence within the narrative, I respect you, but I rebuke that sentiment. All that said, I want to be clear that while Strohl couldn't do what you do, you absolutely cannot do what Strohl does. Let me expound upon this sentiment over in the relationship section.
Yufa, as the priestess, you can command the lance to return to you if it's far away, right?
You would have me use that power in reverse to cast it out instead.
According to Juna, the ceiling of the Opera House has a chandelier big enough to support a person. From above, we'll target Luis in the royal box seats.
You realize the entire audience is below that lighting? Wait, are you...
Luis will be distracted. It's the best opportunity we could ask for. Besides, with Yufa there, we can even recover the lance easily.
So of course, the key relationship Strohl has in this game is with you, the main character. This starts very early on in the recruitment center when a racist Rusant is giving you a hard time. Strohl steps in and defends you even though you are a nobody from the world's lowest tribe. He does it simply because he saw injustice and so he cannot stand idly by. Now, as we know, the main character is actually condensed magla formed from the prince's ideals. This means, just like you and me as we play through the game for the first time, our actual self-insert, our actual character, is also learning a ton of things for the first time. So it's very organic and natural that the relationship between Strohl and the player character is one where they are often teaching each other. Strohl teaches you about the world, how things work, and courses of action to take. And you teach Strohl through your presence and empathy and gentle nudges here and there to completely expand and raise his emotional intelligence and capability to self-reflect. By the end of the game, you can really feel the brotherhood between you two and how he's grown into himself as a friend and an empathetic person. I believe the scene that best shows this was when he called out the king's bullshit when the king was showing the prince his memories in the royal palace dungeon. Rather than try to explain how things got this bad, Strohl would have preferred it if the king took responsibility and accountability and took steps to fix the situation. To be honest, I was thinking the same exact thing as I played. This scene conveyed how healthy Strohl's relationship with his parents was. That allowed him to quickly identify that the king was not being the greatest father to the prince by simply showing him these memories. At the same time, it showed that Strohl at this point is no longer so self-absorbed with his inner turmoil, and he does have the capacity now to actively empathize and support a friend beyond the surface level. Now, the other key relationship Strohl has in this game is with none other than Luis. When Strohl confronts Luis at his soiree, this is one of the best scenes in the entire game. It's very rich in terms of the amount of things it tells us. In fact, I can make an argument that this scene alone tells us literally every detail about who Strohl is as a person. So, you and your party are undercover, and it's imperative in this moment that you are not found out because you are actively searching for the curse's recipe aboard Luis's Skyrunner while this is happening. And yet, Strohl can't keep it together and confronts Luis while he is completely at his mercy, surrounded by all of his supporters. So, if we take a step back for a moment and take a holistic view of this sequence, there is literally no context where this makes sense. It is objectively a bad move that puts you and everybody in your party at risk. So how is it that your party's most savvy member is the one who's making this foolish mistake? It connects back to what we spoke about before. It's not just that Strohl views Luis as responsible for the death of all of his people and his parents, it's more than that. At this point in the story, Strohl would view Luis as basically the absolute antithesis to his parents. The Haliaetus noble ideal, of course, is to uplift the weak, to be a shield. Otherwise, you are not of value to others. Luis's entire mantra is to forsake the weak and to let only the strong survive. So let's summarize everything that's happening within Strohl in this moment. He has these internal feelings of being a failure and not living up to his parents' ideal of a noble. He has a seething hatred of Luis for not lending aid to his village and views him as responsible for the horrific loss of life in which everyone he knew died. And he has a visceral inclination that Luis is the embodiment of everything his parents didn't want Strohl to be. In other words, Luis is the embodiment of injustice that Strohl is incapable of idly standing by and witnessing. This is why I believe Luis is the other key relationship for Strohl, because he incites outbursts in Strohl that we never see otherwise, and these outbursts reveal his inner turmoil. We also witness this when Strohl breaks into tears after Luis is slain. I think that in many ways, while it's never explicitly stated, Strohl sees overcoming and defeating Luis as his path to living up to his parents' ideal of a noble. This is the deeper meaning I interpret when, after Luis is slain, Strohl says, "At long last, my parents can rest in peace." At long last, his parents can rest knowing he lived up to their expectations and the standard they set as righteous nobles.
But today, finally, we have seen justice done. Luis has paid for his sins. And at last, at long last, my parents can rest in peace.
I had not realized you were such an actor. Or do you truly weep?
It's just hitting me now. We finally won.
Now let's talk symbolism when it comes to Strohl. I found some really intriguing stuff in my research, so bear with me. If you've watched my other character analysis videos, then you may recall that some of the characters in this game have names that were very deliberately chosen. Leon Strohl the Haliaetus is one of those characters. Allow me to elucidate. The key parts of Strohl's name are Leon and Haliaetus. Leon is of Greek origin and means lion, and Haliaetus is in the most basic sense the scientific name for an eagle. Now, for some of you sitting there, I know that may not mean much to you. Like, lion and eagle, what do we do with that? But here's a little fun fact about myself. As we all know, everyone cycles through different hyperfixations when they are a child. One of mine just so happened to be Greek mythology, so where you might see lion and an eagle, I see griffin. For those who don't know, a griffin is a mythological creature that is the mix of a lion and an eagle. Symbolically, lions are often associated with power, bravery, and royalty, and are a symbol of leadership and strength in many cultures, representing dominance and protection. Eagles, as a bird that soars to greater heights than almost any other bird, symbolize a higher perspective and the ability to see beyond the ordinary, so they represent vision, wisdom, and freedom. You won't be surprised to know that griffins historically have symbolized a fusion of all of these qualities. Griffins are strength, courage, wisdom, royalty, and protection all rolled into one. At this point in the video, I'm sure you can glean the intentionality of Strohl's name now. His character, his identity, embodies the griffin. He's an indomitable warrior who resolutely protects the weak and rebukes injustice of all kinds. In spite of the fact that he is constantly terrified of failure and mortal peril, he puts on a brave face and exemplifies courage and strength. In spite of being a noble born with all the privilege in the world, and existing in a society where all he has are benefits, he has the vision to look beyond and visualize and work for a world without discrimination. So you see, Strohl is quite clearly the embodiment of the griffin, as he concretizes all of the traits that the griffin represents symbolically. If we ruminate on everything we've discussed today, then I think we can all agree that any parent would hope for a son like Leon Strohl the Haliaetus.
You call this real? Leaders abandon their people and the innocent die by their scorn. If that's the real world, then it can die alongside you! My name is Leon Strohl the Haliaetus. My home and my family were taken from me. I am the last of my house. I am the last of my noble bloodline. And in the name of my people, I will strike you down where you stand! Your Highness, you get in the runner first. We'll buy you some time for takeoff.
We can fight them together.
No. Even if we get the Skyrunner off the ground, it'll all be for naught if anything happens to you. No need to fuss anyway. We'll just kick them around for a bit while preparations are underway. Does that work for everyone else?
Fine. Suppose I'll keep you company.
Had you not suggested it, I would have done so myself.
What else are we gonna do? Twiddle our thumbs inside while Norris does all the work?
Nearest, don't let us down now.
Right. I'll get it done, damn it. Hop in, Your Highness.
Well, let's do this.
I've been a gamer for roughly a quarter century, which is funny because when I say that, it sounds quite dramatic and hyperbolic, but it's somehow true. This is what I do, and I want that to frame the conversation that we're about to have. I believe Metaphor ReFantazio's protagonist belongs in the pantheon of video game protagonists. Atlus struck an impeccable chord with this character, beautifully managing the balance between self-insert and fully fleshed out individual character. Now, as many of you know at this point, I am the character analysis guy for this game we love and cherish, Metaphor ReFantazio, and so this analysis will be broken into 3 sections for ease of understanding. The protagonist as an individual, his role in the story and key relationships, and his hidden symbolisms. Quick disclaimer before we start, and also spoiler warning, although if you haven't finished the game, don't watch this video. I already know that since the words are so similar and that they are the same person, that there will be countless Freudian slips in this video. I'll be saying both prince and protagonist a lot, but I am always referring to the same person, and there's no reason behind it other than my brain being my brain. That being said, let's head back to Uchronia and discuss. I believe it most prudent to start at the beginning. The protagonist is the son of King Heismay V and the Elden Chiefess or Queen. He spent his early childhood in the Sanctum until Sanctifex Forden was able to learn about his existence. Forden could not accept the idea of an eventual Elden King, so he ordered a pogrom to burn the village to the ground. Amidst this brutal chaos, the Elden Chiefess sacrificed her life so her child may live, though she split her soul from her body and transferred it into Gallica, in a last-ditch effort to remain tied to the world so that she may support her son even after death. Shortly afterwards, King Heismay came to the village in the aftermath and took his son to live with him full-time. This was quite a brief respite, however, because when the protagonist was age 6, assassins came in the night to take his life. Of course, they were sent on Forden's order, as he sought to finish the job that he had started prior. In the aftermath, the prince was cursed with a terminal condition, and as it worsened, he was taken away back to the Elden Sanctum in the hopes that they would somehow be able to treat him, and also keep him safe from Forden. Eventually, the prince's body was rendered bedridden and permanently entered a coma-like state, and it was at this point that the lingering soul of the prince's mother created a body of pure Magla using the prince's fantasy novel as a conduit. She then had this body house the prince's soul and his ideals, and this body is essentially who we play as in Metaphor ReFantazio. So let's take a step back now that we've kind of established the contextual framework around the prince's life. As we can see, before the age of 6, the prince experienced a lifetime worth of trauma. Although you don't have the memory or cognition of the traumas that you experienced, since your memories are false prior to rejoining with your original body, regardless, these events will leave an indelible mark on anybody. And I want to explore how that plays a role in the protagonist character. One of my favorite things about the protagonist is that they strike the balance beautifully between idealistic dreamer and practical reformer, and I think what lends credence to his identity being this way is both his circumstances and his nature. We know his father, Heismay V, was somebody who was widely known as an ardent idealist who dreamed of a utopian world, and we know that this is also what drew his mother and the king together. So it's natural that this same idealist energy had the potential to be passed down to the protagonist, and it certainly was. But I think what makes the protagonist so effective in his eventual reform of the world was that he came to know the ugly face of Uchronia during his formative years. You see, as we covered, the protagonist faced all of the world's worst cruelty before the age of 6, and then at that age he was rewarded with a traumatic night and a terminal curse condition, and then he just stewed in that and his circumstances all the way until his body gave way to a coma. So I believe all of this deeply impacted his soul that was naturally that of a peaceful reformer. In other words, I think I would describe the protagonist as a hardened individual. A great supporting point to this is that when the protagonist learns that his mission is to literally murder somebody, there is zero hesitation and he is all about that action. When he needs to rip out his own heart so he can kill a human whose power far exceeds his, he is about that action. When he is ambushed by soldiers shortly afterwards, he is about that action and basically doesn't hesitate to take life. When Rella, the beloved saint, is revealed as a caster, while he doesn't morally condemn her, he basically doesn't have any qualms about her dying. They're bailed out from performing the moral calculus by Rella's life expiring soon and her willingness to go, but I don't see a scenario where the protagonist would have let her live. This is all because he was taught the harsh reality of the world by Fortin's repeated injustices very early on. He is starkly aware of the fact that he needs to actively exert his own will over his immediate circumstances without a debilitating remorse or pause. He doesn't ever divert his mindset or mentality into a woe is me state of malaise or self-wallow, because realistically, woe is all he knows. Woe is not a shock, it is just a fact of his life. And since he knows woe so well, he can comfortably coexist with it and work hard to try to eradicate it from the lives of everyone. So we can see here the confluence of the protagonist's circumstances and his nature forming his identity. His circumstances of trauma and cruel horrors mixes with his nature of utopian idealism passed down from his parents. If you're not following, please allow me to examine some of the existing dichotomies within the story to help you understand.
So I can't give up. In my ideal world, people can believe in their future. Their birth doesn't matter. Not that I expect it will be easy. I believe in you. Familiar words. When I'm down, when I struggle, you're always there to help me through it. Let's do it. You'll be a hero. Trust me.
So I honestly think that we can garner understanding and insight into the prince's character if we think of him, Hypholodius, and Luis as three circles of a connected Venn diagram. The traits and factors that the protagonist has in his circle and doesn't share with the other two are what makes him special and what makes him the right one, so to speak. Let's start with Daddy-O, King Hypholodius V. In his life, Hypholodius had quite literally the most power and privilege of any being in Uchronia. So how did things ever get so bad? Well, his circumstances were completely different to the protagonist. He essentially spent the majority of his life in the safety of his castle, or the Mage Academy, or the Elden Sanctum, in the cradle of power and worshipped by all. He lived within his own interests, with no trials or tribulations. This is a key reason why his novel of Utopia is ultimately not feasible and not realistic for Uchronia. His conception of Utopia is rooted in the fact that his positionality never forced him to consider equity. He doesn't truly know the world and was never positioned in a place within a system where he was systematically oppressed. In fact, this supposition is actually supported in-game by Brigitte, as her first reaction when you share the novel with her is that the author was a sheltered man who knew nothing of the world. I think this is a huge component to why he was so broken by the grief of losing his love and his son. Realistically, this was the first injustice that he had ever faced. And it makes sense that in the aftermath, he basically spent the rest of his life in a state of shock. Think about how starkly this dichotomizes with the protagonist's life. While the prince was formed within the harsh reality of the world and its systems, the king lacked the awareness to know the severity of his true face and was slapped over the back of the head by it as an adult. I want to examine one more dichotomy to explicate the protagonist's identity, and that would be none other than Luis. You and Luis are two sides of the same coin. You both share the exact same formative event that sent your lives on an eventual collision course to battle for the throne, that being the Elden Sanctum being raised by Fortin and the Sanctus Church. Additionally, you both take great inspiration from the late king's novel depicting Utopia. As a result, in the most simple sense, you and Luis want the same thing: a world free of injustice based on discrimination. The key difference is how much you each are willing to sacrifice to achieve that world. Luis is willing to sacrifice every single person in the world who isn't strong, and you want to save everyone and show everyone a better way. In other words, you are more of a practical, morally centered and equity-focused reformer, and Luis is more of an extremist, insurgent revolutionary. So why do your paths diverge so profoundly in spite of how similar your circumstances were? Well, I believe there's a few key differences that leads you two to being so different. Luis actually lost all of his loved ones in the pogrom of the Elden Sanctum, and so did you. Except you didn't. Your mother's love and determination serves as a vital salve at every pivotal moment in your life. As we know, she is the mysterious voice that sets up the framework for you to have your chance to redeem and reform the world. The same is true of King Heismay. His posthumous specter more supports your endeavors and is there for you from the beginning when you begin your journey throughout the world. And Heismay also confirms that he set up the tournament for the throne all in a final gambit that somehow, some way, the world would choose his son. So it's lingering love and belief of your parents that serves as a key differentiating factor between yourself and Luis. Additionally, the protagonist is loved and supported by other people as well, such as Grius and Hulkenberg, who fought desperately to ensure he would live, and the people at the Elden Sanctum, such as Gruide and Russell, who sheltered him from the world and gave him safe harbor while trying every spell possible to keep him alive. So I believe it would be fair to say that what leads Luis down his path, and you down yours, comes down to one simple word: privilege. In spite of all of your hardships in life, you were inarguably born into great privilege. You're the Bloody Prince, born to the two most powerful people in the kingdom. Because of this, not even death could split your parents from you, and many people sought to support you and enable you the chance at a fair life. Luis didn't have privilege. He was born into an isolated tribe at the bottom of the totem pole, and when his family and friends were murdered, they were simply gone, and he had nobody. And thus, he isolated himself, but it would be more accurate to say that the world isolated him, and he didn't know how to break out of that isolation. And that isolation and indignation at what happened to him set Luis's mind into an irreparable determination that he would destroy this unfair world and replace it with one that is completely fair. So again, I believe that viewing these three figures as a Venn diagram is almost a perfect lens into gaining understanding for why the prince is the way that he is. Now let's explore other facets of the prince's identity. Honestly, my favorite parts of the prince are definitely his unwavering kindness and grace, his infallible determination, and his unyielding dedication to empathizing. I believe we can attribute these traits mainly to his nature, and I believe they were specifically passed down from his mother. Gruide described her as a flower amidst the forest, a woman of beauty and grace and kindness. Aside from this first-hand account, we can also glean the veracity of this statement from certain events, such as the king who dreamed of Utopia falling head over heels for her, and her willingness to sacrifice her own life for her son, and also her fierce tenacity to find a way to linger on in spirit so that her son was not left alone. So I think it's fair to say that the radiant core of the prince's personality is mainly inherited from his mother, and I think this is also confirmed and conveyed to us also through the character design of the prince. It's possible you don't recall because we don't get an actual character portrait, but the protagonist's mother also shares in having silver hair and is who the protagonist derives his appearance from. While it's convenient to the story they want to tell, in that it allows us to play as an Elda at the bottom of the world's hierarchy, I think the layered meaning is that they wish to tell us that the prince is mainly his mother's son. His hair color, his darker skin tone, and his blatant lack of physical identifiers that he shares with his father all tell this story. Most of his nature he derives from his mother. I believe the best way to explicate the prince's character is to go through a bunch of quick anecdotes from all of his relationships within the narrative. I'll focus on details that tell us the most about who the prince is at his core, but keep in mind there is so much more that he does for everyone outside of what I mentioned, and were I to mention it all, we'd be here all day. Let's begin, starting with Strohl. You're faced down by a human and Strohl tells you directly that he wants you to run and live your life. He also says that as a noble, it's his duty to protect you. He says and does everything possible to release you from your certain death. Yet, in spite of the fact that you're unaware of archetypes and unaware that you do have the power to save him, you decide to stay and try to save Strohl's life. You help ground Hulkenberg when she quarrels with imposter syndrome once she runs into Radonth again. In spite of the fact that she speaks openly and clearly about the reasons that she may be unworthy, or that Radonth may have justification for his hatred of Hulkenberg, you're able to look deeper than that and help her familiarize herself with the core of her character. With Heismay, you decide to undertake a great effort to help him search the world and find a resting place for his son, even though you're literally on an all-consuming mission yourself to save the prince's life. You don't even hesitate to help him, even though he doesn't want to burden you with the responsibility. In a dire moment that literally dictates if you and your party members will live or die, you are the one who emboldens Nearest and gives him the confidence he needs to save everybody. You're the only person on the entire runner who understands that he needs that vote of confidence, and you spring to give it immediately. You go back and save Juna's life when you don't need to, in spite of Juna telling you to simply escape. In spite of it being very easy to escape and you not owing Juna anything or even knowing if you can really trust her at that point, you go out of your way way to ensure her safety. In general, you display endless patience and grace with Yufa as you help her assimilate to the culture of the mainland. She naturally has innumerable macro and micro misunderstandings, and you never once condemn her for them or give her any grief for it. In spite of Rella literally being the one who cursed you, you tell Hulkenberg to stay her blade and give Rella a chance to speak. At this point in the story, based on what you know, nobody else has wronged the prince more than Rella, and yet, you're able to detach and empathize with Juna and Basilio and Rella herself, and let her speak her piece. In spite of the fact that Basilio was the muscle for your greatest enemy, you let him join your crew, and you put that trust and faith in him. In spite of the fact Fidelio is blatantly antagonistic and rude to you, and actively serves your greatest enemy, you save his life time and time again, as you're determined to help those in need. Maria is a child who you basically owe nothing, and in spite of that, you continually check in on her and try to help her to get over her father's death, and help her learn to make friends in spite of being a mixed girl dealing with the cruelty of other children. When you meet Katharina, you don't know her at all, but regardless, you convince her to stay out of danger and help her find her friend who's in the Grand Cathedral dungeon. When she promises to repay you in earnest, you tell her that she doesn't need to. In spite of the fact that you just met Alonso, after he loses everything, you go out of your way to check in on him and walk him back from the ledge and convince him not to take his own life. At his request, you offer Barden counsel and go out of your way to continually check in on him in the village in spite of your work having already been done and dusted there. In one of Brigitte's lowest moments after her dog is abducted, you recognize that words won't be of service given the pain, sadness, and frustration she feels, so you read her a passage from Moore's novel depicting Utopia, in the hope that it will grant her a glimmer of hope. You promise Moore to travel the world together in spite of the fact that you both recognize that you will be king in this hypothetical future and likely short on time. I want to reiterate that the protagonist showcase his traits of graceful kindness, unyielding determination, and unwavering commitment to empathizing many times over throughout the game. I just wanted to give a plethora of examples that came from a wide variety of contexts and situations. I felt it was important to talk about his relationships and his role in the story in one section because I would argue that the protagonist's key role in the story is his ability to form relationships with others. He is an architect of bridges across metaphorical divides of all kinds. He is the emotional core of the story who draws in all of the key characters into playing a role in fixing the country. He is a great uniter. I think what helps him feel authentic in his role as well is that, rather than being the center of a prophecy, he is an actor in a broader struggle between tribes, ideologies, and social structures. Rather than simply battling an evil overlord, the protagonist is navigating cultural divisions, and I believe his character becomes stronger for it. After all, in his fated clash with Luis, what creates separation between the two is the protagonist's journey itself. Like that age-old quote, "It's not the destination, it's the journey." Throughout his journey, the protagonist garnered close bonds in the support of the public, and ultimately, these were some of the separating factors that gave him victory over Luis.
Then, I put the same offer to you. Join me, Prince. Born of Elden blood, welcoming anyone regardless of tribe. It is no coincidence that you and I take inspiration from the same book.
Don't let him sway you, Your Highness.
I know you detest injustice as I do. Come with me. Let me lend you my power, and together we will change the unfair world we seek to destroy.
I don't seek to destroy this world or any other.
Exactly! He's nothing like you!
Should you deny me, then what? How would you fix this country? You must have seen it everywhere you travel. Tradition, superstition, family honor, and all those struck down unjustly in the name of such authorities. The only cure for such suffering is a simpler world, in which strength triumphs over pain. It is not a solution without cruelty. But surely the fairness it would restore to our lives is worth any sacrifice. Come with me, and we can realize this dream. What say you?
The fairness you speak of is false.
He's got the right of it, Luis. It's not even about what'll be sacrificed. It's about having respect for what the dream costs.
Okay, so there's a lot going on when it comes to the hidden symbolism of the protagonist, so please bear with me. I think we can all agree that the most striking feature about the protagonist is certainly his eyes. As we know, they are two different colors. So the question becomes, did they design him that way just for the vibe and aesthetic? Well, this is Atlus we're talking about, so no. Were we to view it within the context of real life, the protagonist has a condition called heterochromia, which is simply when somebody has two different colored eyes. When researching and exploring the historical symbolism of heterochromia across different cultures and literary works, one trait stood out to me in connection to the prince. Heterochromia can spiritually symbolize an empathic nature or an enhanced ability to absorb and feel the emotions and energies of others. It represents a high sensitivity to others' moods, which enables the fostering of a deep understanding and empathy. I believe that lines up pretty cleanly with everything we've discussed up until this point, but let's go a little bit deeper. I don't know about you, but when we broach this subject, I'm also thinking to myself, why did they choose the colors gold and blue? Allow me to elucidate. Gold is often associated with royalty, so I think we can surmise that part of why they chose gold was to give us an early clue that we were actually playing as the prince. What I also find interesting is that in certain lightings you could honestly consider his eye to be yellow, and we must also consider that gold itself is literally just a metallic shade of the color yellow at the end of the day. So what's interesting about this, right, is that in Japanese culture, the color yellow represents nobility and courage. This stems from the Heian era of Japan when golden yellow robes were worn by the imperial family and aristocrats, linking yellow to nobility. Additionally, yellow is often associated with positivity and warmth, with this meaning being derived from its connection to the sun. The sun, of course, gives us life and brightens up our days, so easy dots to connect there. We know the protagonist to be consistently positive and warm, but I'd take the parallel a step further and say that, just like how things revolve around the sun, the protagonist possesses a gravitational charisma that draws people in, and in revolving around him and his ideals, their lives are brighter and better for it. So what we can glean from this, given the symbolism of the colors yellow and gold both worldwide and also in Japanese culture, is that it was a very deliberate choice for an eye color and not solely for the case of looking cool. This sentiment is also supported when we look into the symbolism of his other eye, which is the color blue. Blue is meant to represent tranquility and reliability, which we can assume derives from the sea and the sky, two constants in our lives. I think that the protagonist proves his reliability throughout the story, and I'd more so say that the tranquility is what he transmits to others. I think there's one more component to the symbolism of the color blue that I believe we can ascribe pretty seamlessly to the protagonist. There is a saying in Japan that I will put here on the screen and not attempt to say it because I would absolutely butcher it. It translates to blue comes from indigo, yet is bluer than indigo. Please allow me to disambiguate this. This saying comes from the fact that historically, indigo dye was extracted from indigo plants that used to create the blue fabric in Japan, in spite of the fact that the color indigo is a darker, deeper shade. So the idea is, this saying is essentially a metaphor for students surpassing their teachers. It symbolizes growth and improvement. In spite of the fact that students learn from the teacher, students end up as the more refined and perfected version of what the teacher is teaching. So, in spite of the fact that the color is extracted from an indigo plant, it somehow ends up as a color blue in application. I think this saying and concept was also part of the conversation when it came to deciding the color scheme of the protagonist, because a huge component to the story is the relationship the protagonist has with Mor, or his father. The protagonist takes huge inspiration from his novel of Utopia, as he was the first reader. It's his father's work, and his body of Magla used the novel as a conduit from which to spring forth. In spite of this, throughout the journey, and by the end, the protagonist concludes rightfully that Mor's depiction of Utopia is not feasible, and not what the world needs. It focuses too much on blanket equality, when considered empathy-based equity is what the world needs. Their ideals clash in a conflict, and afterwards, Mor concedes to the protagonist the rightness of the protagonist's ideals. So, in other words, in spite of the fact that the protagonist came from Mor, both literally and ideologically, the protagonist didn't end up as the same indigo, but rather a more refined shade of blue. The protagonist came from Hypholodius, yet he is more so the protagonist than he is Hypholodius. Blue comes from indigo, yet it is bluer than indigo. Now at this point you may be thinking to yourself, well, these symbolisms certainly line up, but is he going to acknowledge that once you rejoin with your original body none of these colors stay the same? Yes, I am. And for this, I would raise 2 points. Remember that the protagonist, with his heterochromia, is essentially the crystallized ideals of the prince, so everything we just discussed essentially applies to his ideals in general, and his ideals of course are basically the purest essence of who he is as a person. So I believe it would be completely fair for us to consider these symbolisms as applicable to the protagonist in general and as a constant, regardless of his external appearance. The second point I would raise is the color of silver. allow me to walk us through the different things that silver symbolizes. Silver symbolizes purity and clarity, as it's often linked to clarity of thought, reflection, and purification. It represents a clear mind, transparency, and truth. If you haven't had the light bulb moment yet, let me help you turn it on, okay? When the protagonist is beginning the process to rejoining his original body, he has to reflect on his journey thus far. He must ascertain the truth and find clarity into what and who he actually is. In fact, if you're incapable of doing this, or if you just refuse, the game just ends. Once you've reflected and garnered the required clarity of your identity, you join into one pure body. And when the protagonist rejoins with his original body and becomes his authentic physical self, his hair and his eyes become silver. This isn't all there is, because silver is also viewed as a complementary color to gold, and it is linked closely with the moon. Now, the moon connects us to traits such as intuition and subconscious and feminine energy as well. It's possible you don't recall because we don't get an actual character portrait, but the protagonist's mother also shares in having silver be the main part of her character design and is who the protagonist derives his appearance from. The protagonist's mother operates almost exclusively within the subconscious throughout the game, and her intuition is probably her most important trait. So I think the silver colors of the protagonist after he rejoins his original body are meant to convey to us the forever lasting imprint that his mother left on him in all ways, and it's almost like her fingerprint, which showcases the integral role she played in helping him arrive to that point. And you know what? Stuff like this is why I love this game. While you can play this and enjoy the story at the surface level and have it be enjoyable and still make enough sense, there is such a rich depth and subtext that exists for you should you fall in love with the characters in the world. You can truly engage with the experience as deeply as you want, and there's no right way to enjoy these stories. And even if you don't enjoy it, I respect that. But I don't think an objective argument exists for this game being poorly written or designed when we consider all that goes into it and how much everything interconnects and fits together. Quick blurb aside, I do want to address one more facet of hidden symbolism that exists for the prince, and that is the idea that his canon name is Will. I don't really use it that much or at all in my videos, just because I know a lot of people consider this character to be theirs and whatever they named him, but I do want to acknowledge it in the context of this video. I think there are multiple reasons why they went with this name. If we look at will in a vacuum, we could definitely point to the definition of the word itself. A will is the determination or desire to do something, so that fits very cleanly in that Will was the prince's deep desire to travel the world and do what he can to fix it. He was the prince's will. It really could be that simple, but y'all know I can't help myself and I always dig deeper. So what if we think of Will as the name that exists in real life and we consider it just a shortening of the name William? The name means resolute protector or strong-willed warrior, which we can smoothly apply to the protagonist. But what I find fascinating is that the name was originally popularized in England by William the Conqueror. Let's talk about him. William the Conqueror was the Duke of Normandy and the first Norman king of England. He was born in 1028 as an illegitimate son to Duke Robert of Normandy, and members of Norman aristocracy battled each other for control of William the Child Duke during his childhood and adolescence. He made it through these ordeals intact, and in his adulthood he managed to consolidate power after years of conflict. After that, in 1066, William invaded England and defeated King Harold at the Battle of Hastings, claiming the English throne and initiating significant political change. So, right out the gates we can see some very clear parallels between William the Conqueror and our protagonist from Metaphor ReFantazio. Our protagonist was by all intents and purposes viewed as an illegitimate heir by the world, so much so that the king tried to hide his true identity and lineage as an Elder. Our protagonist also dealt with adversity from members of his kingdom during his upbringing and managed to make it through. I'm of course referring to Forden and the Sanctus Church's repeated attempts to get rid of the prince. In his adulthood, our protagonist also battled for a throne and defeated an aspirant to earn it. Our protagonist was also the first of his kind to sit the throne in the same way William was the first Norman king of England. Our protagonist was the first Elden king. And lastly, they both brought about significant political change during their reigns. So the parallels in their storylines are quite evident. I don't think there's much similar in terms of their actual ideologies and who they were as people, but I think there's enough here that I would assume that Atlus had their story carved out for the protagonist and then they may have named him after that. In other words, after they finished the game story and the protagonist arc, they probably went looking for a canon name that would suit that. I believe that due to all of the above, and also the fact that the characters in this game all possess accents based from the United Kingdom, it makes sense that the protagonist would share the name of the man who is arguably England's most significant king in history. Now, I just want to say, to me, I believe this to be one of the most important videos that I'll make about Metaphor ReFantazio. I think with how much more other characters speak, chief among them Strohl and Gallica, and also the fact that you're playing as a protagonist and choosing most of his voice lines, it can kind of get lost in the shuffle that the protagonist is in fact his own character. Not only that, he's a character rich with personality who stands on his own 2 feet as an intriguing person. And I hope this video helped you to understand that if you didn't before, and if you did understand that, then I hope this video felt like a celebration of our boy that we love, the Prince.
First, the people would know how you aim to lead them. How will you respond to that, Your Majesty?
I'll confront any challenge for my people. I know I'm inexperienced, but I'll strive to do my utmost, with all of you at my side.
That's fine. The people have about had it with pompous monologues. Better to say what you mean with determination.
Still, there are a lot of people in the crowd who have never supported you. How are you going to respond to them?
I'll have to let my work prove my words. With results, I hope everyone can feel that our future will be brighter.
You went from a nobody to the top seat in the nation. No need to puff up and bluster anymore, what? You'll do fine.
A ruler must only stand tall. The rest is not done alone. We are with you.
Indeed. And we're no strangers to more practical work. Whatever our tasks, I'm sure we can handle them.
Well, it's time to make your first appearance as our king. Let us brace ourselves.
Good luck!
Thanks for always having my back.
Well, let's go. To His Majesty, the new king!
Oh, good grief! Some things never change. Not that they should.
I'd say life has changed plenty for us. Yet somehow our captain's same as he ever was.
Despite just releasing last fall, Metaphor ReFantazio is a game that was teased 9 years ago, back in 2016. Sidebar, how the hell is 2016 9 years ago? Anyways, you might be surprised to know that the character who was considered the flagship character at that point in time and the center of all the marketing wasn't Luis or the Protagonist or Strohl. It was none other than Eiselin, Burchelli, Meijal, Hulkenberg. What's interesting is that in spite of her central positioning within the narrative, it honestly feels like Hulkenberg is a bit of an undersung character. I don't really see a large discourse around her, and she didn't perform strongly at all in the character polls that we did here on the channel in the recent weeks or the actual Atlus official character polls. However, I believe that she is a wonderful character, and I'm so happy to finally make this video highlighting why she deserves more of our praise and adulation. Now, as many of you know at this point, I am the character analysis guide for this game we love and cherish, Metaphor ReFantazio, and if you're new here, just so you know, this analysis will be broken into 4 sections for ease of understanding. Hulkenberg as an individual, her role in the story, her key relationships, and her hidden symbolisms. Let's head back to Uchronia and discuss. I do believe that when it comes to the surface level, Hulkenberg is probably the easiest character to grasp and identify of everybody in the main cast. By that I mean it's very immediately clear to conceptualize who this character is in the most simple sense. Hulkenberg is a knight in every sense of the word, right down to her core, but like I mentioned, this is only surface level understanding of her character, and I'd like to spend some time here really fleshing out who, how, and why she is who she is. I know some of you may find it disheartening how little we hear about Hulkenberg's family, but I think in terms of the narrative, they told us enough. Hulkenberg hails from a prestigious noble family in the Principality of Montario who earned their prominence through academic study and achievement, mainly in the political arena. Her nature was always that of a fighter, however, and from an early age she was fixated on the martial arts and had the temperament of a fighter. So when she was young, she volunteered for the guard, and you know, I want to pause and unpack her decision to leave her family here. This is absolutely critical in understanding what Hulkenberg is and what she represents to the story. It would be fair to say that Hulkenberg is a scion of the New Age, of the eventual Uchronia, which is reformed to shed race-based discrimination. I say this because her family is a great example of the status quo in Uchronia. They belong to a race at the top and hail from the region of the world where sanctism was born. They spend their time politically wheeling and dealing and vying for power with no consideration for others, and how they could be affected or harmed. In spite of being born into immense privilege and circumstance, Hulkenberg says, "I'm good," and tries to forge her own path in life. In other words, she rejects the status quo and seeks a more moral way of life. And she rejects it not out of necessity, but because it simply isn't right. This is the earliest showcase we have of Hulkenberg's impressive moral barometer and her open-minded nature. These notions are also represented in her relationship with Rodolphe. He represents the old traditional way, and Hulkenberg represents the new conscientious Ukrainian that will come with the next king's reign. To continue, once in the Guard, she had hoped to finally have the opportunity to earn something through merit and merit alone, but her family had already made arrangements to assign her to the Royal Knights. Not for her sake, but to ensure that she would not disgrace the family name by ending up with a posting that didn't reflect well on the family. As we know, it was during her time in the Royal Guard that the fated night of the Prince's curse transpired. Hulkenberg was there and fought with an unyielding resolve to protect him, and while we could say it was due to her efforts alongside Grius that the Prince lived at all, unfortunately, he was cursed and it was terminal. Some point afterwards, Grius took the Prince to the Elden Sanctum for refuge, without letting Hulkenberg know. So what does she do? Instead of blindly maintaining her post, Hulkenberg sets out and travels the world in search of the Prince, convinced that he still draws breath. I believe this journey only expanded Hulkenberg's innate open-mindedness as she came across all types of people and cultures in this journey. I'd also like to add that this journey is a wonderful demonstration of her indomitable strength of will. In spite of having all of the privilege in the world and a purpose-filled posting with the Royal Knights, she chooses every single day for years to do the right thing and live consistently in motion and in rough circumstances to relentlessly search for the child who was unfairly cursed by the world. Now, it might feel like Hulkenberg is just this perfect knight, but I think something that helps humanize her in all of this is that while she does have a great moral barometer and is very in tune with doing the right thing, and while she is very consistent in making the correct choices, she does have internal struggles, specifically with what the right thing costs. Leaving her family, leaving her knighthood and fellow knights, she spent many sleepless nights wrestling with her choices that she made. In other words, it's difficult for her to accept the personal costs and consequences of her choices, but in spite of that, she always forges onwards. I think she explicates it best when she says, "Power is not a tool to torment and kill the innocent, it is meant to guide the weak and vulnerable, that each and every one of us might live together in a better country." And this quote obviously cannot be more diametrically opposed to the status quo, which Hulkenberg rejects at every turn.
You mean, if that's true, then I...
O lodestar who wanders in solemn duty, O thou anguished traveler, thy long stagnant stance hath finally been broken. Now choose thy path.
Now my new calling, transcending all odds, I choose life of my own will!
Thank you. Thou hast chosen a noble parting. Henceforth, thy fears and insecurities become thy light. Thou art the brilliant star that shall illuminate the King's Road. Now, awaken.
My name is Eiselin Burchelli Meijal Hulkenberg. I am knight, I am commander, and last of the honor guards! Once more, I take up arms in my liege's name!
So in a twist, I actually think that these two areas of discussion are pretty intertwined for Hulkenberg. As I mentioned before, it's very easy to grasp the surface level of what Hulkenberg is and what she means to this party. She is the knight, she is the strong protector who constantly sets the example. Let's spend some time outside of that and talk about the other things that she brings to the narrative. I believe at the end of the day, the heaviest value that Hulkenberg brings to the narrative is that she embodies regret. Not just that, but she embodies the positive management of regret and how to take action to amend that emotion, and the idea that it's never too late. Her social link is all about her clash with Rodolphe, who was once her closest confidant and is now essentially a corrupt Nazi cop who is wrongfully murdering innocents under the guise of law and order. Hulkenberg regrets what her potential role may have been in him becoming this way, as she got her place in the Royal Guard instead of him and his seniority simply because of her family, and then she left the Knights and her post to pursue the prince. While she regrets that, she doesn't compromise on her morals to sate her feeling of regret. She does the difficult thing, refuses to look the other way, and brings her former friend to harsh, obstinate justice. Her relationship with regret and how she harnesses it to output positive impact into the world also extends externally to helping others as well. One of my favorite things in this story is that it does well to not make you feel the center of the universe. You're the most important cog, of course, but I love the depth of the relationships that the other characters have completely outside of you and your influence. So I want to say that this is actually one of my favorite moments in the entire story. I'm of course talking about Yufa's archetype awakening. The reason it's one of my favorite moments is because of Hulkenberg's presence and role in it. It's Hulkenberg who guides her to her destined path and connects with her in a way that nobody else could at that point in time. I think it's beautiful that the writers recognize the similarities between the two characters. By that I mean they are both characters who have spent the majority of their conscious lives wholly consumed by duty. Hulkenberg with her duty of knighthood, and Yufa with her duty as a priestess. Their similarity in mindset and their similarity in being committed individuals to causes and ideas larger than them is what connects them in spite of them just recently meeting. Due to Hulkenberg being a bit more older and experienced than Yufa, she has the capacity to guide her along the correct path. Hulkenberg knows the cost of blind duty, and she has shed it twice before in her life, when she left her family to become a knight and when she left the Knights to search for the prince. While she struggles with the costs, her morals never waver. So she helps Yufa understand how to live beyond her life's purpose, how to live in the gray that must be navigated to better the world. Now, of course, we must continue on and talk about her other key relationship that defines her role in the story, and that would be the prince. I'm sorry for all my shippers and simps out there. While I count myself amongst your ranks, I can't join you in this particular case. I believe she is positioned as a protective big sister more than anything else for the protagonist, and I for one actually appreciate the lack of romantic undertones between you and her. Again, if you see it, you can see what you want to see, but that's just my opinion, you know. All that said, it's quite clear that Hulkenberg is a borderline zealot when it comes to the prince. She imprints on the prince in a way that goes beyond duty, and I believe this is largely a result of her background with her family. I think in a way she sees herself in the prince, and she wants to protect that reflection that she sees. Hulkenberg was also a child with a predetermined path, and in her case, her family made quite clear they didn't care for her or her wants, they only cared for how she could further the family name. I think in a way, Hulkenberg would have saw this royal child in front of her as somebody who still perhaps had that innocence that she had before she realized these things about her life and her family, and that would have been reinforced with their interactions, as the prince was a child who was obsessed in creating a better world and who took after his mother, who was loved by all her people and widely known as extremely kind. So I think she wanted more than anything for the prince to be able to live the life that he chose and nobody else. And I think that all of this, interwoven with moral responsibility and her actual duty as a royal knight, coalesces into what we see within the game. An unbridled and fierce protective love for the prince. So of course, when the prince is cursed and then disappears, Hulkenberg is racked with regret at her incapability to protect him, to protect this person in who she must have seen her younger self. But she refuses to be frozen by this immense regret and chooses every day to forge onwards irrepressibly until she reverses the situation. And I believe there is great beauty in this.
You mean to say that it was not merely pretense to claim the prince's name? He truly was His Highness all along?
If that's true, this is finally your reunion with your sworn liege. Seems like cause for rejoicing, eh? Lady Hulkenberg of the Royal Guard.
But I failed to protect His Highness.
No. I am sure the strength of your devotion had a hand in saving him.
While all and sundry believed the lad had shuffled off, you alone kept the faith, milady.
Fate was changed.
Are you really His Royal Highness the Prince? Please, please forgive me, Your Highness. I failed you when you needed me most. And more, despite being a member of your royal guard, I did not recognize Your Highness at our meeting and showed you such insolence.
Actually, You've been there for me this whole time.
He's right, you know. If we'd not met you, we'd certainly never have made it this far.
This time, I will protect you. Even should it cost me my very life. I swear to it.
Just like the other members of the main cast, there does indeed exist some fun symbolisms with Hulkenberg's character. Something I kept coming back to when I was ruminating on what they could be was her whole shtick with food and how she can stomach and eat anything. It's a fun gag, but I always come back to why. Why is this a feature of her character? While they play it off as, oh, she's traveled the world all these years and had to get used to it, the more I thought about it, the more I felt there had to be more to it. And I'm pretty confident in concluding that her willingness to eat all kinds of strange foods symbolizes her trailblazing open-mindedness that we spoke of before. Something that people kind of skate past is that there is basically no greater representation of a culture's heart than food. The types of cuisines that people prepare, the recipes that we pass down from loved ones to nourish ourselves, how we use the land and its resources to extend and enrich our lives. These are all things that are uniquely shaped and informed by our area and our people, by our culture. There's actually a word dedicated to this, and it is gastronomy. Gastronomy, in the most basic sense, is the study of the relationship between food and culture. If we accept what is truth, which is that food is basically at the heart of the idea of culture, then we can transpose this understanding to Hulkenberg's eating habits and very clearly define that the underlying point to her constantly being shown eating everything no matter what location you're in is meant to convey her willingness to accept other people and other cultures. It's meant to tell us that in spite of her being the most privileged person in the entire group as a noble Roussant with a wholly intact family, she is somebody who is fundamentally open to accepting those who are below her in the world's hierarchy and fundamentally open to embracing other cultures and ways of life, which is the mindset and ethos that a healthy society needs. All in spite of the privilege that she's had since birth. I thought up one other interesting thing in my contemplations and research, and this connects to Hulkenberg being a knight. What specifically sparked my curiosity was that in the culmination of her duel with Radanth, in speaking to the Shadowguard Knight afterwards, the knight refers to Hulkenberg as Dame Knight. Sounds cool, but also, was that really necessary? Well, it got me thinking, right? So Dame, for those of you who don't know, is essentially a title that denotes the women equivalent of the rank of knight. So if a knight is Sir Blank, then a woman knight would be Dame Blank. It was completely unnecessary for them to include that throwaway line, and yet they did. So I thought of some of history's most prominent women knights, and the one that most closely connected to Hulkenberg was Joanna of Flanders. Joanna, or Joan of Flanders, was a woman who lived from 1295 to 1374. She was described by notable 18th century philosopher David Hume as the most extraordinary woman of the age. Where I see parallels to Hulkenberg is that Joan was a woman who was thrust into the middle of a brutal succession war. The narrative for Metaphor ReFantazio is essentially one long war for succession. She had to fight because her husband John of Montfort was captured and imprisoned and their son was too small to lead, which left her as the only one who could carry on the family's claim. So when French forces came to siege the ramparts of Hennebont, instead of surrendering, the indomitable Joan instead chose to fight. She donned armor, rallied the troops, and led sorties, which are basically small attacks, against the besieging army. One night, she led a legendary surprise attack in which she led 300 men on a charge and burned down the enemy supplies and destroyed their tents. After this, she became known as Jeanne la Flamme, excuse my French, which translates to Joan the Flame. Let's take a breath here and highlight the parallels. Just like how the prince was taken from Hulkenberg, Joan's husband was kidnapped. Just like how Joan chose to fight, Hulkenberg chose to continue to try to find the prince and eventually chose to fight in his absence as well once she determined he lived. Just like how Joan fought not for herself but for her family to have a chance to rule, Hulkenberg also fought for somebody else's prospects, the prince. Might I add that Joan's efforts laid the groundwork for her son to eventually become the Duke of Brittany, just like how Hulkenberg's efforts going all the way back to protecting him the night he was cursed laid the groundwork for the prince to eventually become king. Something else that I want to add is that Joan's iconic title as Jeanne la Flamme is certainly reminiscent to me of Hulkenberg's signature vibrant red hair. One more parallel I'd add is that after Joan's successful defense of Hennebont, she eventually took to the sea to sail for reinforcements from England. She was successful, but her and the English fleet were intercepted on the way back. In a hard-fought battle, her and the English forces eventually dispelled the attacking ships. Why did I include this anecdote? Well, because the attacking ships were led by a man named Luis of Spain. I just thought that the coincidence and parallel was funny. Both Joan and Hulkenberg had ops named Luis. Honestly, compared to the other symbolisms that I've discovered and connected to characters of Metaphor ReFantazio, I do believe that Hulkenbergs are a bit weaker in terms of my capability to definitively say this is what the writers had in mind. But alas, the symbolisms and parallels exist and they fit, so I felt they were certainly worth discussing. The Dame Knight Hulkenberg is a character that I think should be celebrated and elevated more than she currently is, but at the end of the day, I'm sure if she had insight into the discourse around this game's story and her role in it, I'm sure that she wouldn't have it any other way. She is somebody who lived her life in service of others, in service of doing the right thing, and in service of being an open-minded recipient of other cultures. I'm sure Hulkenberg would be thrilled that we as a community largely focus on and praise her friends and people she protected and provided a platform for. And that in itself, I think it's very special. She's a wonderful character, and I believe she was worthy of being the original flagship character for this game when it was first announced a whole 9 years ago.
The man of the Shadow Guard paused before departing. As he bid me farewell, he told me he hoped to one day be my equal. A knight not merely in title, but in truest spirit. I never thought the day would come that I might see the honor in myself. As a knight, and as an ally, I will stay by your side, now and always.
Okay, y'all, so this embodies the weight of experience and transformation quite like Heismay. A man shaped by years of isolation and grief, Heismay is the hardened elder of the group, jaded but undeniably wise. What makes Heismay so unique within the narrative is that his worldview is sculpted not only by isolation, but by a lifetime of being othered. Yet, as the game unfolds, Heismay undergoes a profound metamorphosis, challenging not only the protagonist's beliefs but also his own. His journey is not just about grief, it's about what comes after, the struggle to move forward, the tension between acceptance and resistance, and the possibility of rebirth. Through his relationships, his philosophy, and the painful choices he makes, Heismay becomes more than a mentor. He becomes the heart of the game's exploration of loss and redemption. Now, as many of you know at this point, I am the character analysis guy for this game that we love and cherish, Metaphor ReFantazio. But if you're new here, just so you know, this analysis will be broken into 4 sections for ease of understanding. Heismay as an individual, his role in the story, his key relationships, and his hidden symbolisms. Let's head back to Uchronia and discuss. Heismay's depth makes him one of the most compelling characters in Metaphor ReFantazio. His story is not just about grief, but about what comes after, how loss shapes us, how we struggle to move forward, and how understanding can bridge the deepest divides. His advanced age and wealth of experience makes him a figure of deep insight, yet his perspective is shaped by a lifetime of isolation and being looked down upon. This has left him slightly jaded, his worldview hardened by the circumstances of his upbringing. For example, I've seen that a lot of people are confused about Heismay's initial mindset earlier in the game, most notably his conversation with Juna, in which is revealed that he has a deep disdain of Parapus. Some people find these racist comments by Heismay out of place or perhaps unbefitting of a party member, but the writing here is actually awfully realistic, and I think it is brilliantly conveyed. Allow me to explain. Yes, as we know, Heismay's son died in a Parapus riot, but it's more than that. Let me draw a parallel to real life to sort of help to frame Heismay as a character. And please stick with me, as I think this is really valuable for understanding Heismay. I think we can all agree that scientifically, anecdotally, and from our own personal experience, that our childhood and teenage years are formative years. The nurture and environment we grow up in determines a lot of who we end up becoming as adults. If you're raised by saints in a really great environment, you likely won't have a lot of internal deprogramming to do as an adult to become a good person who fits seamlessly into society. Though, of course, there are always exceptions and outliers. If you have a bad upbringing in terms of your parents and circumstances, then you will probably have more deprogramming to do in your adulthood than your peers to become a good person who fits seamlessly into society. Now, again, it is crucial to acknowledge that exceptions exist. Many people rise above societal conditioning, but it is also true that environments shape likelihoods. To briefly wrap this, I'm saying we can all agree that it is way easier to be a good, successful adult if you have a good childhood with a good environment. In other words, different people have different privileges and different belief systems that are instilled in them in their formative years. And depending on what those are, you will have more or less work to do as an adult to center onto a good path. Are you following? Let me explicate with a hypothetical. Imagine a man that is 78 years old, today in 2025. Let's say this man was born to his parents when his father was 41, so pretty standard. That would mean we're talking about an adult now in 2025 who was born in 1946 and raised by a man who was born in 1905. So, in other words, this full 78-year-old adult now had his formative years literally before civil rights. Not only that, but he was raised by someone who had his formative years in the 1910s and 20s. This was a time frame where women couldn't vote, and the KKK literally had an estimated 3 to 6 million members. So this 78-year-old man, who probably has raised and guided multiple generations of children at this point, and been a part of and possibly led multiple organizations, had his formative years in an environment where racism was the norm, and his main role model and influence was someone who had his formative years when racism was even more abundant and women couldn't even vote. Now, if you don't know, I'm American. And I won't get too deep into this, but there's a phenomenon in this country where there's a contingent of people who don't think racism exists now and that it only lives in the history books. Even if you ignore all of the blatant real-world examples that refute that, you could still glean from what I just went over that implicit racism is still pretty rampant in today's world. And that's completely logical if you consider how recently overt racism was the norm in this country and how our adults and elders are all raised by people whose formative years belong to that time frame. There is a lot of internal deprogramming that the vast majority of people need to do in this country in adulthood because of the environment everybody had, but also because of the parents and nurturers that a lot of people had. Shit, I mean, I'm still in my 20s, so I'm a pretty young guy. My dad was born in 1953. Let me repeat that. I'm in my 20s, and the man who raised me and who I molded myself after was born before civil rights. I want everything I just covered to serve as the lens through which we view Heismay as an individual. Heismay is an old man. Yuji's are probably right below Elda as the most hated race in Uchronia due to them being the most different to others. They're nocturnal and possess distinct appearances that you'd more closely connect to a beast rather than the other races. Growing up, Heismay grew up in a mostly isolated village of Ujiv. He loathed how the village operated, as they relied on short-term alliances with other villages to keep afloat. In other words, they relied on the power of others and not their own. Heismay mentions that being a child, he escaped being convinced he was lesser and instead pursued honing his skills so that he may gain acceptance of the other races in the big city. His work bore fruit, and he was eventually able to leave his village and become a knight of the royal capital. Although he initially felt that he was finally accepted as equal by both his fellows and strangers, he eventually came to ascertain the falsity of that notion. You see, Heismay was only welcomed into the Knights so they could use him for the Shadow Guard, a unit that performed the dirtiest deeds that were kept secret. Eventually, Heismay drew a line, and in return he was stripped of his title. From here, everything snowballed, and the culmination was his son dying in a Parapest riot. To be clear, what increased the tragedy of this event was that his son died slowly, and had somebody tried to help him, he probably would have lived. But because he was just a Ujiv, the people ignored him bleeding out on the ground. I resurfaced those details so we can analyze how it all plays a role in Heismay's identity as an individual. In Heismay's formative years, both his environment and his nurturers conveyed to him both overtly and subliminally that he was lesser. It wasn't just the bold-faced standard racism, but also how the world reacted to Heismay when he worked hard and proved his worth. He only gained the perception of others once he became objectively great at something, but after that he was still cast aside and sent to the shadows, and this is all independent of his son's tragic death. So, to tie this back to my earlier points, Heismay, at the end of all of this, was faced with an inconceivable amount of deprogramming that would be necessary for him to functionally exist in society. We can say the root of Heismay's self-imposed isolation in that cave is grief, but I think that would be a disservice to the immensity of everything that he went through in his life. His son didn't just die, the world told him time and time again that both he and his son didn't matter. We have to place credence and emphasis on Heismay's status as an old man. Remember my example of a 78-year-old man in today's world. Heismay has simply spent more time stewing in the injustice of the world, and his formative years were also spent in a world with both people and environment more harsh than the current Uchronia world state, so he has far more work to do than the other characters to reform his identity into one that is worthy of being a model to others. I recently did a video in which I ranked every single awakening from both Persona 5 and Metaphor ReFantazio, and one of you said something to me that I found really profound and that I feel connects to this and captures the essence of Heismay. Let's take a look, guys, and Roxy, I really hope you don't mind me sharing and paraphrasing your comment. Roxy said, "I liked Heismay's Awakening a lot because I read it less as accepting your circumstances and more accepting your failings born from those circumstances. As someone who had an unfair lot in life, I felt the weight of my mistakes when I made them because I had no guardrails or safety nets to insulate me from the fallout. Then, even when I made it past the worst parts of those circumstances, it took a long time for me to let go of that guilt. It's easy to wallow in what ifs, but at some point you need to forgive yourself because self-flagellating doesn't do anyone any good, and there is plenty of good to be done out there." I believe this speaks to the quality and realism of Heismay's character that Roxy, myself, and I'm sure many of you can relate so strongly to him. While we might perceive his message in slightly different ways based on our life experiences, I believe Roxy put it best as they illuminated the idea of hardship and the struggle to move beyond it. The essence of Heismay comes down to forgiveness. We can forgive ourselves for things that lie out of our control while simultaneously striving to enact positive change and reform in ourselves as people. We can forgive the ignorance of others, the ignorance of our environments, while fighting like hell to unravel that ignorance. It's easier said than done, but this is part of what's so inspiring about Heismay. In spite of everything we've discussed, when the moment arrives and you enter his cave and speak with him, instead of trying to dispose of you to preserve his isolation, he holds back, and he willingly cooperates with you. In spite of his long, unfair life in which the world told him he didn't belong, in spite of the fact he feels he has nothing to live for, in spite of his immense guilt, tangled grief, he still has a fuse inside waiting to be sparked by somebody with the flame of hope and compassion. And you, of course, serve as Heismay's liberating flame. I think probably the best little detail to look at to see how much Heismay changes throughout the story is how in the epilogue he is placed with Basilio. They're clearly hanging out, and I believe this was a deliberate choice to convey to us that Heismay has grown beyond his hatred of Peripus and shed the ugliest part of his identity.
I am Heismay Noctule. I believe the arc of life depends not upon birth. By these hands, soiled or sinless, I fight!
Heismay's presence in the game is essential. In fact, without Heismay, the game would have ended about 15% of the way in, as there would have been no way to reach Joanna, who you'd likely be forced to kill, which would have left you with no way to get close to Luis. In fact, let's talk a little bit about that. I do believe that this is some of Atlus's best writing to date. Joanna, or Joanna, has been committing arguably the worst crimes of anybody within Metaphor ReFantazio's narrative. That, of course, being kidnapping innocent children and feeding them to a human that she has deluded herself into viewing as her own child. What led Joanna down this road was what happened to her own child. As you may recall, Joanna had a mixed child, and due to the old traditions, the people wrested her son away and put him to death simply for being mixed race. So Joanna has coped with her grief by viscerally taking her pain out on the world and disassociating to the degree that she refuses to accept that her child is truly gone and has fully convinced herself that the human is her child. Joanna juxtaposes brilliantly with how Heismay dealt with his circumstances because, as we know, Heismay retreated to a cave and withdrew from society with the hope that a monster would kill him eventually. So, in other words, the tragedy of their situations utterly broke them. But because they are both broken by such similar circumstances, once they encounter each other, their minds are able to coalesce and help each other finally grieve in earnest and begin the healing process. They share the burden. In spite of having every right to do so, Heismay does not condemn Joanna. Even though he was her main scapegoat, he chooses to instead connect and relate to her, and I'm not sure if Heismay would have made this decision prior to meeting you, and I feel he conveys as much when he says his eyes were opened by you and the party. Heismay's grace eventually drags Joanna back to reality, and ultimately she commits herself to helping you and your party. When she is killed for her crimes, she says to you that being able to confess was more than she deserved, and she accepts the consequences of her actions. We can glean from this that she was in all likelihood a decent person prior to what happened to her son, so I'd like to say, based off of her arc and what Heismay himself goes through, I believe that one of Heismay's primary roles in the story is to showcase the transformative power of grief. He is meant to teach us very early in the game to view other characters in the story through a different lens. Luis has callous ideals and has caused the suffering of thousands, but he was irreparably transformed by what happened to him as a child. Hypholodius let the Sanctus Church run rampant in spite of his ideals of a world of equality. These two pillars of Uchronia were both transformed by grief, and that should inform how we view them as a player. Just like the example Heismay set, I believe we can commit to fiercely correcting them in their varying mistakes without completely condemning them. I think Heismay serves another key role in the story, and that is explicating to the player the difference between equality and equity. This is a concept I find many people struggle with in real life, to be honest. People think blanket equality would solve societal problems, but that largely isn't the case. What we should seek is equity. Heismay says it best when he says, "You cannot pretend at diversity without acknowledging our individual differences." And when he says, "Equal competition doesn't mean equal footing." Allow me to supplement this sentiment with the example of a classroom, as I believe most of us have experienced being in one at some point. Equality would be having a row of students all sit the same distance from the whiteboard or chalkboard. Equity would be having the students with the worst vision sit closer to the board. To give a Metaphor ReFantazio example, let's stay in the classroom, but pretend we're in Uchronia. Equality is having a class where all races can attend that starts at 8 AM. Equity is having two classes open to all with the same content, one that starts in the morning and one that starts at night, because UGF are nocturnal and would be disadvantaged attending a class in the morning. So to at least provide them with the option of a night class would be equitable. To simply strive for equality and ignore their inherent differences would not. As an old man who belongs to the most uniquely distinct race, Heismay is best positioned to understand this concept more than most, and so he settles in seamlessly, almost as the dad of the group, who makes sure that you remain cognizant of catering your worldview mainly through empathy and not just through blind justice or a blind effort to do what you and you alone think is right for everyone else. Rather than simple camaraderie, Heismay constantly challenges beliefs and helps shepherd the group along the right path. Speaking of Heismay being the pseudo-dad of the group, let's chat about his key relationships within the story.
And you? Do you not condemn her? She kidnapped children, murdered them in cold blood, and would see you blamed for it.
In truth, I know this woman's pain all too well.
Huh?
In the name of her child, she was willing to turn against the entire world. Behind her atrocities, I see the devotion of a bereaved parent. You found yourself unjustly in a terrible darkness, and I struggle to blame you. Burying your own child is unbearable. Grief and madness fill the gaps where love had been. But my eyes were opened. These people helped me see. The only way to beat the darkness is to confront it. Step by meager step. You must walk back to our reality. Look upon that, and see true that it is not the child you once loved.
Part of why I appreciate the dynamic between the player character and Heismay so much is because oftentimes in storytelling, the elder statesman of the group serves to guide and inspire others to become the best versions of themselves and achieve success within the narrative. Think of Ben Kenobi and Luke Skywalker, or Harry Potter and Dumbledore, for example. The list goes on, but in this story, that trope is flipped on its head, and you, as the young, inexperienced person, inspire Heismay to undergo his transformative change. This, of course, is the most significant relationship Heismay develops, and the protagonist happens to be the same age as his late son. This dynamic sparks transformative growth in Heismay, leading him to refer to the protagonist as his star of hope. His paternal instincts, which were buried beneath years of grief, resurface, allowing him to reconnect with the world. Throughout his social link, Heismay tells you about his life, about lessons he's learned, and you work together to finally put his son to rest. Eventually, he decides to keep his son with him at his heart, and rather than spread his ashes in the traditional UGF way, he asks Euphausia to make him a necklace of his son's bones. First of all, shout out to Euphausia for that, but second of all, I know that might sound kind of out of pocket, but please abandon logic for a moment and let's just think about the message. Heismay is basically committing here to accepting his grief over his son and forgiving himself for the years afterwards in which he lost his way. No matter what, he'll never forget the impact of his son on his life and the meaning of everything he went through. He's more motivated than ever to rid the world of its oppressive world state that caused his son's death. Heismay professes that your presence is what helped him undergo this transformation and ensures that you know he thinks of you as a son. It's beautiful stuff. I do believe Heismay also serves as a valuable thematic contrast to Luis, as they are both people shaped by tragedy who ended up joining the nation's military. They were also both framed for crimes that they didn't commit. Beyond that though, there's nothing too deep here, but I can appreciate that they set up their backstories with similar events to convey to us that the world itself is broken for such things to happen to all types of different people in it. Outside of that, I'd be remiss not to mention Basilio, who I touched on earlier, but the main reason this relationship is key for Heismay is it showcases his positive transformation throughout the game and capability to deprogram away from his racial biases against Parapis rooted from his son's death. Now, let's get into what I assume is most of y'all's favorite part.
No need for tears, lad. I myself am finally content for once. Thanks to you. We two have spoken of much, eh? Sometimes it's felt as though my son himself has been advising me. And well, I've been through no small pains on this endeavor. But it was that experience that brought me to my decision. After all this, you are like a son to me yourself, you know. Your life, your ideals, I will protect them as my own. Another toast then. To us. To my son. And to the children. And their future.
So, Heismay's hidden symbolism is a bit more straightforward than some of the other characters we've covered. Simply put, his last name Noctule is actually a word for a bat that is common in Eurasia and North Africa. We can also look at Heismay's character design and be pretty confident in saying that the U-Chief design is based off of bats. Generally speaking, the imagery of bats are a universal symbol of rebirth. Let me explain why. Bats roost in caves, which have long been seen as gateways to the underworld or the womb of the earth. Their nightly emergence from caves represents a return to life, much like a rebirth. Another reason is that in many cultures, nighttime is linked to death, while morning signifies renewal. Since bats are nocturnal and disappear at dawn, they embody the cycle of death and rebirth. So, I believe knowing all of this, it was a very deliberate choice that Heismay's character and his arc within this game was what it was. I mean, damn. If you don't believe they drew a very deliberate parallel between Heismay and the symbolism of the bat, remember that you literally found him in a cave. And as we've discussed, Heismay is metaphorically reborn after meeting the protagonist and shedding his past despair and finding new purpose. We could also draw a parallel from Heismay's character to ancient Greek philosopher Plato's allegory of the cave. For those who are unfamiliar, I will try to explain what the allegory of the cave is in a compact way. Plato's allegory of the cave describes prisoners chained inside a dark cave who have never left the cave, and they're only able to see shadows cast on the wall by objects behind them. They mistake these shadows for reality. One prisoner is offered freedom and discovers the outside world, realizing the truth. When he returns to enlighten the others, they reject him. The allegory illustrates how perception is limited. True knowledge requires enlightenment, and people often resist new ideas that challenge their beliefs. I think this could be another reason that we find Heismay in that cave, to connect us to this allegory. In Heismay's scenario, it's almost like he self-imposes himself as one of the prisoners chained to the wall. So it's the reverse of the allegory. Heismay knows the outside world and was victim to the raw horrors of it. So he rejects it and chains himself and his mind and refuses to see anything else but the shadows on the wall. The shadows on the wall being his grief and self-wallowing. Eventually, you come into the cave and offer Heismay his freedom, just like one of the prisoners was freed in Plato's allegory of the cave. Atlus loves to layer double and triple meanings into their environmental storytelling, so I'm quite convinced that these parallels were intentional, and the evidence we went over reflects that as well. While it's not overly complex, Heismay's symbolism is succinct, and I genuinely appreciate how they went out of their way to have the character designed to look like a bat also share in the symbolism that bats have in real life. The cave and connection to Plato's allegory was just icing on the cake. Awesome stuff.
I couldn't abide it. Reality was too painful, and I ran until I was spending my nights and days in the sandworm's pit. Better to live in solitude than in the embers of hell. That was the real reason I lived in that den of beasts. I thought death would be a mercy.
Heismay.
And then these meddlers came along. They dragged me under the night sky I'd not seen in many seasons. And beneath those stars, it finally came to me. This is not the life my son would have wanted for me. That thought changed my whole perspective. His memory deserves love, not pain.
Heismay's journey is one of painful reckoning and eventual renewal. He is proof that grief, no matter how deeply ingrained, does not have to be a permanent state. Through struggle, reflection, and the influence of others, even the most jaded souls can find a way, a path to redemption. Metaphor ReFantazio uses Heismay not only as a vehicle for its themes of loss and identity, but also as a mirror for the player, challenging us to confront our own biases, our own pain, and our own capacity for change. And perhaps, like Heismay, we too can find our way forward and utilize empathy to pursue equitable ideals. This character analysis video is a unique one because it will be the only video in the entire series to feature two characters, the characters of course being Basilio and Fidelio. I feel that the Brothers Magnus are inextricably linked, perhaps more so than any other two characters within Metaphor ReFantazio's narrative, and thus, it's only right that they share an analysis video. There's a reason these characters resonate so much with most people who've played this game, which is actually reflected in an ongoing poll Atlus is doing where fans can rate their favorite Metaphor ReFantazio characters. Basilio literally ranks first outside of the main characters of this story's narrative, and Del ranks ahead of all the other minor characters in the story, and even ahead of some of the main ones. Of course, I've also seen some of you in our comments section asking for the Brothers Magnus, so it's only natural that I listen and we run with this. Stick around to gain a new understanding of Bas and Del. Let's head back to Uchronia and discuss. I think it makes the most sense to start with the how. How did the Brothers Magnus come to be? For lack of a better term, Fidelio and Basilio were street rats as children. They had no parents and lived on the streets with nothing. At some point, Basilio went to enlist in the army so that they could have a better life, but he was rejected due to his age. The military then instead referred them to the Igniter Development Facility, where they told them that they would be helping to test igniters before the soldiers got them. What they didn't divulge was that they would be testing the igniters on them, meaning an entire generation of poor parapists with nowhere else to go were subjected to horrific experiments. Experiments where whether they lived or died didn't matter because unfortunately poor parapists were not in short supply. They received slave wages and room and board amidst these circumstances, which persuaded many parapists to stay and just suffer through the circumstances, as they deemed this to be better than the alternative, which was free on the streets but with nothing and struggling for basic human needs every single day. Clearly, all of the choices available for these parapists were dreadful. The experiments they underwent impacted every parapist involved in a variety of ways, ranging from physical to psychological, and left lasting scars assuming they managed to somehow survive. Basilio, for example, has lasting chest pains that he needs to treat with varying remedies, and Fidelio actually had his growth severely stunted as a result of the experiments, which is why he is Napoleonic in nature, or in other words, short as fuck. Eventually, Basilio reached death's door due to the experiments, and that's when Fidelio spurred into action and sprung their escape, and managed to carry Basilio to a church. I want to pause here and point out that this is the first showcase of the Achilles heel, so to speak, when it comes to Fidelio's character. In spite of his nigh unrivaled IQ and perception, Fidelio is only able to take significant action when he sees his little brother in danger. He lacks a little bit of drive and ambition, and maybe a bit of courage. If you think about it, Fidelio has the intangibles to be a candidate in the tournament for the throne himself, yet he settles for continuing to work under Lord Luis. This is actually one of the things I find most endearing about Fidelio, which is that at every turn of his life, he basically sacrifices everything that he could be, just so that he can solely live a life that keeps Basilio as safe as possible. Remember, it's said countless times in the story that when they were younger, Del basically kept Basilio alive day to day and basically raised him. Without the burden of Basilio, who knows what Del could have accomplished. He is a true model example of what an older brother should be in the context of a brotherhood. To return to their origin story, it was at the church where they met Rella and she managed to heal them. I also believe this is where the seeds for their compassion for others was planted, not just alone through Rella's actions, but from the counsel she gave them. Rella said to Basilio and Del, "What is like now, it's not all there is. If you keep living, the world will surely change." If you consider the arc of their lives, it would be fair to question why they care about anybody at all. when they were born into the streets with no parents, food, or shelter, were then tricked into horrific experiments, and then eventually joined Luis's army. And of course, Luis's whole mantra is that strength is the sole barometer for a person's right to live. Well, clearly the only thing we can point to aside from their nature is this brief encounter and experience with Saint Rella. I'd argue that her actions to save them, in spite of her owing them nothing and knowing nothing of them, and then her words of wisdom, served as the foundation for them existing afterwards as fairly respectful people even under Luis's employ, and their eventual betrayal of Luis way down the line. I think this point is corroborated by Vinca's character arc. I believe Vinca is meant to show us how the Brothers Magnus may have turned out had Del not sprung him and Basilio and had they not encountered Saint Rella. Vinca never escaped the Igniter facility. He was tortured until the end and mistakenly tossed out with the corpses. But he survived, and so when we meet Vinca, he is filled with righteous hatred towards the world and actively murdering upper-class people with a hand in the Igniter business. He's a serial killer. Vinca's arc also serves to showcase that Basilio is an independent thinker in spite of his notion that Del did all the thinking for them, as Basilio rejects joining his long-lost childhood friend in the murdering, in spite of the hatred they both share towards the upper-class Igniter businessmen. What's interesting about this is that at one point Vinca says that Del would have supported him, and while you might recoil at the thought, part of me wonders if Vinca has the right of it. Fidelio is a fiercely loyal individual to his people, and supporting Vinca or looking the other way would have been the path of least resistance, or most likely to keep Basilio safe. So I don't think this is too far-fetched, but in this scenario Basilio still would have been present, and again, we've seen time and again that Basilio is an independent thinker who consistently voices the truths he feels in his innermost moral barometer. So while I don't think the Brothers Magnus would have supported Vinca, I do think that he kind of has a right of it when it comes to that specific statement. I want to switch gears here and talk about symbolism, as I feel the symbolism of the brothers kind of connects to the recent points I've made. So, when it comes to the name of the Magnus brothers, Fidelio Aureus Magnus and Basilio Lupus Magnus, I believe the key symbolism here comes from Lupus for Bas and Fidelio for Del. Basilio's is lupus, which means wolf, and I've deduced it to indicate lone wolf, and the name Fidelio stems from the Latin word fidelis, which means loyalty or faithful. Now, gleaning the meaning of Fidelio's name is quite simple. To expound, like I mentioned, fidelis means loyalty or faithful. The foundation of Fidelio's life is his loyalty and caretaking of Basilio. That is the one thing that has been at the core of his being at every stage of his existence. Additionally, Fidelio has a loyalty to Luis where he reveres him to the point that he kind of views him as a religious figure. In spite of the constant moral red flags, he's never able to reject his faith until the moment that would become the very end of his life. Fidelio or fidelis being synonymous with loyalty isn't particularly complicated, but it's still a very spot-on and fair metaphor for Del's character. Now for Basilio, the symbolism in his name is a little bit more intriguing to me and less on the nose. I mentioned that the most significant part of his name is lupus, which means wolf. I believe the indication here and the track that they were following is to tell us that Basilio is symbolically meant to represent a lone wolf. Now, you might think a lone wolf is just somebody who's a loner, but let me explain the actual zoology from which the term stems from. And really quickly, if you don't know, zoology is essentially just the scientific study of animals. To continue, wolves are actually highly social animals that live in packs, but some young adult wolves end up leaving their pack to form a pack of their own. These lone wolves are called dispersers, and they play an extremely important role for all wolves holistically. They keep wolves healthy by bringing in new genes into the mix with different family groups. In other words, they're the key to the genetic survival of the species. So let's unpack this because there's a lot going on here metaphorically speaking. Basilio is the lone wolf. In the story, he ends up leaving Luis's pack after Del's death finally confirms to him what he's been pondering for much of the game, that maybe Luis's way isn't right. In fact, you could argue that Basilio embodies the lone wolf even prior to Del's death, considering he was already stepping out from not just Luis's ideologies, but his own brother's, in that he begins to voice things about Luis and their current path that his brother won't. To continue, he doesn't just leave Luis's pack, he joins a new pack, that of course being your own. A driving force for him doing so is he wants to ensure that the impending world state is a world where people who are weak like he and Del used to be can survive and have the chance to grow. Basilio's want to ensure the survival of others directly parallels the lone wolf's motivation for striking out on their own, which is to keep the species healthy and ensure that wolves genetically have the capability to survive. So, in other words, philosophically speaking, Basilio embodies the mindset and motivation of a lone wolf or a disperser. We can see this at play in the literal sense in the epilogue, where we see that Basilio has offered a place and function for the people who follow Luis. Instead of condemning them, Basilio instead assimilates them into his pack, dragging along Luis's men and ex-commanders onto a better path. So we can see that Basilio is a disperser in this story, but instead of bringing new genes into the mix, which wolves literally do, he's bringing new ideas and ways of doing things into the mix. And just like the new genes ensure the survival of wolves, Basilio's new ideas ensure the survival of the Parapus people and the betterment of the world. To continue along, in my research I also made a few other interesting connections when it came to Basilio and Fidelio. So, Fidelio's name is the name of the only opera that Beethoven wrote. Additionally, Basilio shares a name with a character from the famed opera, The Barber of Seville. The fact that both of their names have ties to opera is fascinating to me. I'm not sure there's much depth to the symbolism here in terms of the characters, but there's a few nods to it. For example, the climactic moment for the Magnus brothers where Del dies and Basilio fully switches sides takes place in an opera house. Also, it's Basilio's idea to spread word that your character is actually the prince himself, and in the opera, The Barber of Seville, the character named Basilio also creates false rumors about another character who isn't the person that they seem to be. But beyond that, there isn't much here, and I'd assume that the writers for these characters really loved opera and just wanted to include a few references. Part of me wonders if they knew they wanted to have a climactic opera house scene in which a major character would die and then kind of worked backwards from there when naming the Brothers Magnus. If I had to guess, it would simply be that, as there isn't much here. I'd like to conclude this video by speaking to why I think the Brothers Magnus resonate with so many people. I believe the core reason for that is twofold: their relationship with each other and their individual identities. The relationship is something that I think most anyone with a sibling could relate to, in the sense that it's what we all want from our brothers and sisters. They display loyalty to each other above all, in spite of their vast differences, and in spite of the fact that at multiple different junctures in their lives, it would have been easier for them to abandon each other. There are many times that we see Basilio start conversations with Del with, "Listen, I'm with you until the end, you know that, but..." And I think that disclaimer is a really beautiful thing. The term unconditional love is what continuously comes to mind when I think of the Brothers Magnus. As for their individual identities, again, I can see how it's compelling. Basilio is somebody who really resonates with me as someone who's a baby brother of two older brothers. On the external, he's the feared destroyer of the army and then your party, but in private scenes, he's open and vulnerable about things ranging from his innermost feelings to his growing doubts about Luis, having seen you and your companions work together up close. I think that his emotional vulnerability and his capability to raise his hand, admit his wrongs, and course correct mark Basilio as a true man in every sense of the word. These are all traits that I believe to be some of the most important when it comes to masculinity. The mental strength and physical fortitude to achieve your goals, coupled with consideration for those with less, and an intentionality about introspecting and understanding your emotions in relation to the world. This is Basilio. He's a true example. As for Fidelio, he's your classic standoffish genius who's more good than he'd like you to believe. He's extremely smart and perceptive, and no doubt his wit is the main thing that allowed Basilio to live and reach his potential. He also seemingly harbors an unrequited love for Lady Juna, and I believe unrequited love to be something that the vast majority of people have gone through at least once in their lives. So we have a character that manages to be both relatable and inspirational at the same time. Relatable in the sense that he self-sacrifices his potential for a loved one and loves someone that he can't have, and inspirational in the sense that he's extremely smart and able to ascertain truths that others just aren't. So with consideration to all this, I think in many ways the Brothers Magnus complete each other, but I think the point of their characters is that they're not complementary pieces to each other, but foundational pieces instead for each other's formation of identity. Del raised Basilio up and gave him a chance at life, and once Basilio grew into himself, his light is what forced Del to shed his layers of cynicism that he put up in the first place so he can ensure Basilio's survival. So I believe these characters are so popular due to the beauty of their relationship and their individual identities. These boys have awe-inspiring synergy and individual qualities that we should all aspire towards and look to implement within our own characters.
Del, you hear all that? What that cry was talking about?
Yeah. Sounded proper familiar to me.
It's easy to blame the Sanctus Church for the whole thing, but maybe not all of them were happy about it. Makes you think. I remember St. Rella looked like her heart was breaking, seeing us at death's door. Maybe she knew what was going on. Del, what do we believe in, really? Are we absolutely positive that, you know, Count Luis's vision and ours have enough in common?
thought we were done talking about this. He's the reason we got this far. A couple of Parapus orphans. Nobody else wants us. Nobody cares about us. We'd be nothing without Count Luis.
I know, Del, but... he makes all them speeches about equality, but in the end... he's gonna leave the weak to die. I heard him talk about his ideal world, and... it sounds like a world where we'd have died alone in the dirt. No Saint Rella to save us. Is that what we're fighting for?
Too late for that kind of talk, brother. Blood on our hands either way.
We finally arrived at the big one. In this video, we will be analyzing Luis Guiabern, who, for me, might just be the most enthralling and captivating villain I've experienced in my 20+ years of gaming. The depth and nuance that lies within this character is an absolute joy, and I'd love to share with you what makes Luis that dude. In order to keep this video extra coherent and easy to follow along, I've broken it into 4 sections. Luis as an individual, his role in the story, his relationships, and his hidden symbolisms. Let's head back to Uchronia and discuss.
Let your late King Saul bear witness. Let Luis Guiabern be named the true and rightful ruler of Uchronia.
So let's start at the beginning. Not the beginning of Metaphor ReFantazio, but the beginning of Luis Guiabern. I think there's a misconception when it comes to people understanding why Luis became the way that he is. I feel like the assumption people make is that Luis became committed to his crusade in the way he is because the Sanctus Church raised the Elden Sanctum. In other words, people read Luis as, they burned my shit down and killed my people, so I'm gonna remake the world so that this shit can't happen again. But actually, there's more nuance to it, and Luis himself alludes to it. To put it in other words, for Luis it's less about the symptoms of the unjust world state and more about the core sickness at the root of the world state. To elucidate, it's less about what the Sanctus Church did to the Elden people, and more about the fact that they live in a world where this would even be possible. You see, Luis despised how isolated and secretive the Elden people were from the rest of the world. Ironically, he wanted to be able to exist in the world freely, and exist comfortably amongst the other races. The irony, of course, is that Luis ends up as a lone pillar who deliberately forms connections with nobody, and views people as pieces on a chessboard with the goal of the chess match being to reach his ideals, when all Luis wanted was to freely exist with other people and have an open community. Listen, the world obviously came to know Luis as this indomitable force of nature with peerless capability and intellect, but I don't think he could have become this if he was solely driven by revenge. To use another metaphor, think of Luis as the camel from the idiom about the straw that broke the camel's back. For those who don't know, the idea of the straw that broke the camel's back is basically the idea that one single piece of straw broke a camel's back in spite of the camel's role being to haul things, and a piece of straw being infinitesimally light. The idea is that the camel was at capacity with other things to the point that one single piece of straw was what took it over its physical limit. So while it looks like to us that one single piece of straw broke the camel's back, in actuality, it was the continual accumulation and buildup of other seemingly small things. To tie this back to Luis, the raising of his village by the Sanctus Church wasn't the sole thing that created him, it was just a straw that broke his back. It might seem like an overreaction to become this seemingly peerless demigod with a single-minded hyperfixation of completely reshaping the entire world just because your village was burned by the church when you were young. The more natural reaction might be to seek revenge on the Sanctus who did it and spit on their graves. But for Luis, his village burning was just the crux of a lifetime of grievances with his existence in this unjust world accumulating. It was the spark. So the motivation of Luis is clearly multifaceted when we look at it deeply, and I think this is a huge component to what makes Luis so peak. Let me explain. For my anime and manga people, I think you'll understand this one. This is a really unique trait for a villain, but he is exactly like a shonen protagonist or even a video game protagonist. Think about it. Being the victim of a tragedy at an early age, the way that he pursues his goals is very pure and consistent. By that I mean he doesn't resort to underhanded methods or cheating to get ahead. Probably the only example you could raise in opposition to that would be Luis murdering the king to get access to the royal scepter, but Heismay at that point in his life fully wanted death and wouldn't fight Luis in any scenario, especially considering that he already had a full contingency plan dependent on him dying. Luis was monologuing in the man's chambers, and Heismay had every opportunity to scrap if he truly wanted to. The other thing that you may mention is how he pretended to be Clamar, but I'd argue that he didn't really have a choice, with consideration to the world state. Had he tried to reach his goals as an Elder, he would have constantly been under assassination attempts by the church and incapable of getting people to group up under his banner. In other words, it wasn't an underhanded choice, but a simple prerequisite to starting his journey. To continue, A lot of villains have goals and aspirations, but they typically don't apply those standards to themselves. What's cool about Luis is that he applies his own mantra of fairness to his own life, to the point that he says he wouldn't even bother resurrecting from the dead because the simple fact that he was dead would mean that he was wrong and didn't deserve to live under his own ideologies. And what is Luis's ideology? To condense it down, Luis essentially believes that power is the only fair thing in the world. In other words, it's the only measure that holds zero bias, and thus it is true justice. So his long-term goal is to release the Magla of the royal scepter, which holds the anxiety of the masses, back onto the masses. And then the people who survive this ordeal and conquer their anxiety would be the ones worthy of living in his new world, as they would have earned it through their own strength. It's basically a gambit to enact forced evolution on the populace of Euchronia, erasing all of the racism and injustice in one fell swoop, and letting the just people live on, i.e. people with the strength to conquer their anxiety. But what makes Luis so reminiscent for me of a shonen protagonist is that he lives by his ideology. He doesn't just preach it and then try to achieve it. You see, Luis abhors lying, and while he might withhold information until it is most advantageous to divulge, he never lies. He pursues his goals openly and honestly, and welcomes anybody to challenge him. What's really interesting about this is how it clashes with you in the narrative. The entire first act of the game is you lying just to get close to him so you can try to murder him. I think it's really cool how they kind of flip the dynamic on its head in terms of what we typically see from heroes and villains in these stories. We line by to commit murder while Luis openly and honestly marches onwards towards his ideals, and even goes so far as to not make any moves to try to kill us or get rid of us or detain us, even though it's heavily implied that he suspects us the entire time we're undercover, especially after we give him Dracodios. The last note I want to make here about Luis as an individual is that if you consider how Luis became radicalized, what his initial wants were prior to that happening, and his private dialogue at the royal palace with the king and himself, I do believe that he is an inherently selfless person. And that doesn't change after he's committed to reshaping the world. He pursues his goals not for personal gain or for revenge on the world that wronged him. He's doing it because he truly wants to save the world. While the man has the correct motives, ultimately his methods or his end goals are proven to be incorrect and the wrong conclusion to fixing the corrupt world state of Euchronia. Now that we've taken a closer look at Luis as an individual, let's analyze his role in the story.
A land grotesque as its people. You dreamt of utopia. You saw the tribes united as one.
Oh.
That dream died long ago. You should have done the same.
I think it was a boon for Luis that before you even start the game says to you that he is the villain of this story, and the game holds fast to this concept. It never usurps him with another villain who is bigger or badder, or a twist that removes him from the story. In fact, when they briefly do this, they adroitly have Luis be the one to kill his supposed replacement in the narrative, Forden of course, which further builds up Luis's character and aura within the story. What's cool about this is that if you think about the narrative of Metaphor ReFantazio holistically, Forden is essentially the main villain of the wider story. He forces Rella to curse the prince, he raises the Elden Sanctum, he siphons power away from the crown. These are literally all the root causes of the main things that worsen the world for most of the main characters in the story and in general. And of course, what sparked Luis. To continue, it's a testament to Luis that he was able to remain compelling throughout what is essentially a 50 to 80 hour game. And I think a big reason for this is that when I think of Luis in this narrative, I think of balance. They struck the balance with Luis flawlessly. He has the mystique of a peerless warrior and strategist, and yet your conflicts and confrontations with him are still done in an unbelievable way. In other words, his power isn't diminished by the fact that you are the main character. You fight multiple close battles with him throughout the narrative, and none of your confrontations feel cheap. Each side gets their hits in a way that's very believable. Starting from the top, Grius was absolutely going to kill him if the king's magic didn't intervene, which you can read from the shock on Luis's otherwise aloof and confident face. On the night you try to murder him, he takes the hit of the lance and survives it, as opposed to some sort of deus ex machina where he magically dodges or catches the lance. His damage from the lance gives you and your party the chance to defeat him, and I want to pause here and say, this scenario is exactly what I'm trying to articulate when I say they struck the balance and made it so that none of the Luis confrontations feel cheap. You spend half of the game trying to position yourself to murder Luis, you make a great tactical decision very early on to get undercover and close to him in his cohort and wait for the right chance, and when the chance comes, you finally create a legitimately solid plan after recruiting Yufa, and securing Dracodios, which can break through the king's magic. In other words, you earned Dracodios and you earned the opportunity to take out Luis. We're talking about 30 plus hours of game time working on achieving this moment, so it would have felt cheap if he simply caught the lance or dodged it or took the hit and ran and recovered, but instead, due to who Luis is as a character, he saunters up to that roof and even relinquishes his advantage that would allow him to kill you all with no trouble. He accepts your duel, in spite of the fact that he's holding all the cards. You even end up winning this battle because he's severely injured, though Zorba tends to him in the aftermath, unbeknownst to you. While this might sound contradictory, I think this sequence is a great example of the fact that, ironically, Luis's greatest weakness is actually his peerless strength. You see, the fact he is so powerful is what prevents him from being successful. Luis is the indomitable pillar of strength. Nobody comes close to him. You and your party use legendary magic, and yet you never defeat him all the way up until the end of the game. But because of his strength, Luis doesn't form meaningful connections with anybody and chooses to fight alone against you in every single battle. Because of his overwhelming strength, he retains the ability to openly and honestly pursue his goals and never uses alternative methods or ways of thinking to get ahead. It's also because of his strength that he underestimates you and your party. In the climax of the game, he ends up becoming a human because he succumbs to anxiety. Perhaps the main underlying message Luis's arc in this game conveys to us is that even the mentally and physically strongest person conceivable can succumb to their innermost anxieties. We all need community in some way, shape, or form, and we all need to feel supported and loved by our fellow humans, as these help to mitigate against anxiety and bolster our mental health. Not even invincible Luis can go it all the way on his own.
I will never let injustice be repeated. Never again!
If you've watched my Metaphor ReFantazio tier list video where I ranked every single character in this game, or my video where I ranked every story arc in this game's narrative, then you may recall that I coined Luis as the Atlas of this game's story. In other words, like how Atlas holds the world on his shoulders in Greek mythology, it's upon Luis's shoulders that this game's story rests. With that sentiment in mind, I've noticed that when it comes to Luis in this game, it seems that other characters serve almost as mirrors for us to view different reflections of Luis. Early on in the game, through Grius, we can understand the menace of Luis, through the fact that he joined the army as a child and was feared off-rip as a ruthless military genius. Grius describes him as a prodigal tactician and a master of the Magla arts. He also describes him as a cunning genius who was the youngest general ever who quelled the rebel uprising swiftly and gained undying support from his men. And this is the grizzled war vet Grius, and so this serves to build up Luis as a threat and help us understand as players that he's worthy of being the primary antagonist. This impression clashes with the dynamic between Luis and Juna. At no point in the game do we see Luis abuse Juna or force her to do anything that she doesn't want to. In fact, he always lets her do what she wants to. We also never see Luis make any pass at her or attempt to get close to her, and it's revealed at one point that he truly enjoys her singing. So through his relationship with Juna, we can see that while Luis is a villain, his villainy lies contained within the path towards his goals. He doesn't exercise immoral behaviors or acts upon those who are outside of his path to his ideals. I think this is also one of the few humanizing details for Luis too, the fact that he simply likes Juna's music. It's the first hint to us that underneath his mystique, his calculations, his confidence, his cerebral nature, he's just a human, just like anybody else. You could say that Rella's character is meant to serve the opposite purpose in the context of Luis's character in this game. Rella reveals to us that she's convinced Luis is a horrific monster because she touched his hand before and read deeply into his Magla and felt a vision of humans flooding the country and complete chaos. This, of course, was Rella perceiving his long-term goal of forcing evolution upon the people of Uchronia. The visceral description of what Luis's success would bring upon the world is meant to recenter us and help us understand that no matter what he says or does, Luis is wrong. Eupha's relationship with Luis is pretty adjacent to Rella's when it comes to its purpose, which again is to show us that Luis is very wrong. Eupha, of course, is built up prior to meeting Luis as a very pure and innocent individual who's capable of mending the divide with even the Sanctus people who view her with complete reprehension. She doesn't condemn anybody, not even a Mustari who wished for her death. But she meets Luis for 2 seconds and is like, yeah fam, y'all had it right, we gotta kill this motherfucker. Through the Magnus brothers, we get a glimpse into what Luis is like as a leader. Del's death is where we can glean the most, as there are a lot of minor details surrounding Luis in this scene. He is surprised by the Magnus brothers protecting the bystanders, and when they do, he isn't personally offended that they did so. He's more so upset that they didn't stay committed to the cause. He doesn't feel betrayed, he feels disappointed. After Del dies, Luis appears to be briefly saddened and frustrated, which is contrasted brilliantly with Zorba's theatrically evil gloating. So we can see here that while Luis is willing to do whatever it takes with no hesitation, there are still bits of humanity left within him. It's not entirely easy for him to sacrifice so much to attain his goals in spite of his unwavering commitment in doing so. So the Magnus brothers in the context of Luis's character arc serve to reinforce the notion that he is selfless and not in it for personal gain, as he didn't want to or take any joy in holding to his ideals when it meant killing Del, someone who had worked for him for a long time. Basilio is also the only person in the entire game to get a rise out of Luis when he compares him to Forden, who, of course, is the most evil person in the story. Luis's reaction to this shows that he genuinely views himself as an agent of good and denies the thought that he would share anything with a person like Forden. I think this also serves to show us that, despite what Luis would have us believe, deep down he does care about people interpersonally, or rather that deep down he does yearn for human connection. Because Basilio is someone who he spent a lot of time with and knows better than others, so I think the main reason the Forden comparison stung so much is because Basilio was someone who Luis may have respected or even had a deeply hidden and internalized fondness for. Through Zorba, we gain an understanding into what Luis represents to many of his supporters. You see, Zorba is quite clearly mixed race, and he's a zealot for Luis to the point that he refuses to destroy a picture of Luis, even though that would allow him to also destroy a threat to Luis. What this tells you is that Luis is offering the beaten down people of the world true hope, and is the first person to make them feel the world can be a place where they can feel welcome. We can juxtapose that with Luis's relationship with Strohl. We know Strohl to be a righteous noble in a world where nobles typically aren't righteous. By all intents and purposes, he's genuinely a great man. So it means a lot that Strohl rightfully has probably the most intense and seething hatred for Luis of anybody in the game. This is of course because Luis destroyed his village by withholding aid, and in this event, almost everyone Strohl knew died, including his parents. Luis did this to amplify the threat of the human menace to the masses and garner more support, but through Strohl, we can understand the cost of Luis's ideology. When Strohl confronts Luis, Luis nonchalantly confirms that he did allow his village to perish, and this is a fascinating moment for Luis because you can glean from his brief initial flash of sadness and then his cold logic afterwards that Luis isn't on this crusade for cruelty's sake, and he isn't committing all of his atrocious acts just for the sake of evil. In fact, in his warped mind, he's committing them for good. He is fully committed to doing literally anything to reach his ideals. Luis's relationship with Hypholodius serves to show us his most authentically true self. In his scenes with Hypholodius, both alive and dead, he has no reason to uphold any pretense. In every other scene, he has some element of facade, because he is with other characters or in front of a crowd, or he has something to try to gain. But in these scenes, he finally has a chance to vent his frustrations unfiltered. And what we can confirm about him is that he truly wants to make a better world, and he's not in pursuit of any form of revenge or anything self-serving. In other words, he's in pursuit of a positive reformation to the world state for the good of the people. He acknowledges that while there is peace, it isn't authentic because there's only a peace because of a societal system of predator and prey, where certain races are thrown under the heel. You can feel Luis's frustration at injustice, and of course a big part of what he is drawing on in these scenes are his unresolved feelings from what happened to him as a child. Luis definitely reads as having PTSD from the raising of the Elden Sanctum. I agree with Strohl saying Luis is still trapped in that night of flames, but I believe it's just a small key part of him, not his entire being, if that makes sense. His goals for remaking the world allowed him to cope by never actually processing what happened to him. He throws his entire being into achieving his ideals, and this allows him to never have to stop and face the horrors of what happened to him. I think this is a big part of why Luis succumbed to anxiety at the end of the game. He falls apart because the simple fact he is losing to the party forces him to confront the fact that maybe he could have done things differently if he was able to process what happened to him and learn to trust and fully connect with other people again. This is only an earth-shattering realization or difficult thing to process for Luis because he is not a rotten individual at his core, and he told himself each atrocity he committed was purely in service of good. So for Luis to face you at the end, someone who has a member of every tribe, someone who has committed no atrocities, someone who's saying the world doesn't need to actually burn, someone who's saying the weak can actually live, for someone like you to be defeating him and disproving his ideology of strength is justice, ironically by overpowering him, it was just too much to bear. This of course is all exacerbated by the fact that you are both Elda, which brings us to Luis's relationship with the main character, the prince. This relationship is meant to convey to us that Luis isn't just a dastardly villain operating outside the realm of sanity, but rather that you are two sides of the same coin, and this should be considered by you, the player, as you navigate this game. You and Luis both share the exact same formative event that sent your lives on an eventual collision course to battle for the throne, that being the Elden Sanctum being raised by the Sanctus Church. You are both the only main characters in the game to be Elden. In the most simple sense, you and Luis want the same thing. A world free of injustice and free of the oppressive systems making it so that most people are downtrodden. The key difference though is how much you are each willing to sacrifice to achieve that world. Luis is willing to sacrifice every single person in the world who isn't strong, and you want to save everyone and show everyone a better way. You have the same goal with completely opposite methods to achieving it. You constantly seek connection with others in order to better understand the world so that you may shape it best for all, and Luis is dedicated to connecting with nobody so that he may prove that strength, and strength alone, is the true justice. This is best depicted, in my opinion, in your second confrontation with Luis. Luis stands alone, and you stand with a member of every single race behind you. The framing of this scene is meant to convey the protagonist's ability to connect with people and strengthen his ideals, and simultaneously how Luis has abandoned the current idea of society and wishes to tear it all down no matter what. In other words, you are a reformer and he is a misguided abolitionist.
I desire but one thing, a world without inequality, and I shall gladly offer my shield to all of those who follow this ideal. Those who do not, however, will be slain without mercy or regret. It could not be simpler. If your equality means you will sacrifice the people who need help most, then I deny your world! So, you think you have the strength to protect the weak? Then prove to me these are more than empty words.
Now, if you've joined me for a video before, then you already know what's coming. What we do here is we uncover the hidden symbolism in the characters of Metaphor ReFantazio. After some research, I was able to deduce that Luis was inspired by Lucifer, specifically Lucifer from Dante's Inferno. For those who don't know, when I say Dante's Inferno, I'm referring to the narrative poem published by Italian writer Dante Alighieri in 1321. In Dante's Inferno, Lucifer is of course a fallen angel who used to serve in heaven until he became enamored with his own self-importance, and he began to believe that he should be on the same level of importance and glory as his creator. His pride led to a revolt that earned him banishment into hell. Lucifer is depicted as frightening and looks to be all-powerful, but in actuality, he is powerless. Why? He is powerless because of his isolation. He's trapped in the ninth circle in hell and isolated. He holds no power to enact anything of meaning. In Dante's Inferno, Lucifer is described as the emperor of the reign of misery, which is exactly how I would have described Luis were he successful in living in the world that he endeavors to create. Let's expand the elucidation and further connect Dante's Lucifer to Luis. Luis's core tenet of his path is how he isolates himself from others, and this idea to isolate himself is born out of an undaunting pride and self-belief in his own capabilities. So the same way that Lucifer's pride earned him his isolation, so too did Luis's. To continue, quite frankly, Luis is trapped, but it's more metaphorical than Lucifer's situation. As Strohl alludes to, a part of Luis is still mentally trapped in the night that everything changed when his village and loved ones burned. The fact that he is stagnant mentally and can't process his trauma and evolve his way of thinking is exactly what renders him powerless in the face of you and your party's ideals, both of course being ideals of community and collaborative effort of strong and weak alike, and mending the world. To continue and reframe, like Lucifer, Luis is trapped. His own ninth circle of hell that isolates him though is the night of his village getting razed. Psychologically, he remains trapped in that happening to him, and he embraces his isolation and never processes the event and escapes it. If anyone is not buying the comparison, sit right where you are and let's talk design, okay? In Dante's Inferno, Dante depicts Lucifer as a huge beast with 3 faces and 3 pairs of wings. Only his upper body is in view, and he is seen gnawing on 3 people in each of his mouths. They are Brutus and Cassius, the men who betrayed Julius Caesar, and Judas, who of course betrayed Jesus Christ. Now, you're probably not surprised to hear this or recall this, but Luis's form has 3 faces, 3 pairs of wings, and also chews on puppets at various points in the battle. I believe with consideration to Luis being inspired by Dante's depiction of Lucifer, it would be fair to say that the fact Lucifer chews on Brutus, Cassius, and Judas, and Luis also chews on 3 figures, is meant to symbolize that Luis will devour government, country, and faith should he be successful. In other words, there wouldn't be a society left, only a land of misery. I say this because I believe we can glean in this context that Brutus and Cassius represent or symbolize government and country, considering that they betrayed both when they assassinated Julius Caesar, and of course, Judas represents or symbolizes faith, considering that he betrayed Jesus Christ. Really quickly, I'm sure I don't need to explain who Jesus is. Shout out to him though, by the way, what a legend. But for those who don't know, Julius Caesar was a Roman dictator who was famously assassinated by a group of his own senators during a Senate meeting. So if we really contemplate all this, then I don't think there's any way to refute that Lucifer is a big inspiration for Luis's character arc and journey within Metaphor ReFantazio. All that said, I think when you understand the depths of Luis, you kind of understand that in actuality, Luis is kind of a tragic figure. He's somebody who is inherently selfless and who genuinely wants to be a force for good, opposite of injustice, but his PTSD and inability to process his pain from a horrific event that nobody should ever have to go through warps his decision making and defines his path in life. And this path in life that Luis departed on hurt countless people, was unbelievably lonely, and at the end of it all, it led to his death. In spite of him being our biggest op and extremely problematic, I do hope, at least, that he found some solace in Juna's singing, because it seems that was the only window into peace that he would have had in his entire life.
It was only pure injustice. A selfish act of devastation. One thought alone burned in my mind. I would never let it happen again. And so did I walk on.
It was tragic.
Thus, I choose to make this a land of eternal, perfect equality, even should it cost my life. I shall return the anxieties endowed upon this scepter, and let it be heard. To burden others with your own fears and responsibilities is cowardice. My royal magic shall craft a world where that cannot be. Such cowardice dies. My house no longer stands. Where are you from? Have you heard of a village called Halia? Certainly. It was the first village to be destroyed by the human menace. Only because help never came. They requested reinforcements, but the army wouldn't spare a single soldier. Are the rumors true that was by your decision? That is true. But why? To save this country. Strohl! The Fool King and the fossils of the Sanctus Church refused to face the threat looming over this country. An adequately dramatic demonstration was required. They say you could see Halia burning as far as the palace battlements. Confronted with that balefire, those old men could no longer deny the human threat. Your balefire cost hundreds of innocent lives. Do I offend you? Are you repulsed? Surely it helps you realize that you can protect nothing without power. The natural blessings you enjoyed are not infinite. Few have the luxury of living with no need to struggle and harm just to survive. But our nation would have you believe such hardship is born of moral weakness. So the punished are punished further. They die in silence like livestock. Their reality denied. It defies reason. All people deserve the chance to fight for their lives with their lives. Some will fall, some will triumph, and therein is true equality forged, however cruel. I am not one to stand idly by as history is wrought. All their sacrifices, and yours, shall not be in vain. A valuable conversation. I do hope you enjoy the